I've always been comfortable in the outdoors. Bugs, snakes, unpredictable weather. I never considered any of it a real threat. But that changed one summer night in Shenandoah National Park, when I learned what it meant to feel truly trapped, helpless, and disgusted beyond words. It started as an innocent camping trip. My college buddy and I decided to drive up from James Madison University to catch the Perseid meteor shower. We both worked at an outdoor gear shop, so borrowing some quality camping gear wasn't an issue. I grabbed my two-person tent, and he packed his hammock and tarp. We were looking forward to a quiet night under the stars, away from campus, away from people, just the two of us and the Blue Ridge Mountains. The hike in was exactly what we wanted. Peaceful, remote, and just challenging enough to make the effort feel worthwhile. It was an out-and-back trail that ended at a cliff overlooking the rolling ridges of Shenandoah, the kind of spot that made you forget about all the small stresses in life. The air smelled crisp, fresh with pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. When we reached the overlook, we didn't waste any time setting up camp. I found a nice flat patch of dirt a little ways from the cliff's edge and pitched my tent, securing it properly so I wouldn't have to think about it later. My buddy preferred sleeping in his hammock, so he strung it up between two sturdy trees about 15 feet away. It was still early, so we gathered some wood for a small fire, ate a couple of quick snacks, and then walked back to the cliff to watch the sky. The Perseids didn't disappoint. Shooting stars streaked across the sky in all directions, burning out in silent bursts of white and gold. We lay there for what felt like hours, heads propped up on our packs, watching the heavens move. There was no wind, no distant hum of cars, no voices, just us, the quiet of the wilderness, and the endless sky. Eventually, exhaustion crept in, and we decided to turn in for the night. I crawled into my tent, zipped the door shut, and lay back against my sleeping bag, still thinking about the meteors. Everything was perfect. For a while. I'm not sure what woke me at first. Maybe it was instinct, some deep part of my brain sensing something was off. But as I lay there in the heavy silence, my breath slowed, ears straining, I heard it. A tiny, faint sound. Then another. And another. My first thought was rain, but when I listened closer, it didn't match the steady patter of a drizzle or the sharp strikes of a heavier downpour. This was irregular. Random, coming from all around me. I held my breath, focusing. The taps were light but distinct. It sounded as if tiny fingers were drumming against the fabric of my tent. Some were soft, barely audible. Others were firmer, like something small but substantial landing just above my head. At first, I told myself it was leaves. Maybe a light breeze had kicked up, shaking the trees. Maybe small twigs or bits of bark were breaking loose and landing on my tent. But as the minutes passed, the sound didn't stop. It wasn't wind. It wasn't leaves. And worst of all, I could feel them. Tiny, almost imperceptible movements along the fabric. Something was shifting, crawling, skittering. A chill ran through me. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, just paranoia setting in from being alone in the dark. But I wasn't hearing things. I wasn't making this up. Something was out there. Something was above me. I swallowed hard, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. My fingers itched to grab my flashlight, but a deep part of me hesitated. If I turned it on, I'd have to see whatever was out there. And a part of me didn't want to know. I lay there, frozen, the tapping continuing, the soft movements shifting just beyond my line of sight. Minutes stretched on like hours. My breath felt too loud, my heartbeat even louder. Then, something fell. It wasn't just a sound. I felt it, a tiny, distinct impact on my sleeping bag, just above my shoulder. I reacted without thinking. My hand shot out, grabbing my flashlight. In one motion, I clicked it on and pointed it straight up. And my stomach turned to ice. Above me, covering the entire mesh roof of my tent, were centipedes. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. Their long, segmented bodies twisted and wriggled in the artificial light, dozens of tiny legs gripping the fabric. Some were small, only a couple of inches long. Others were much larger, 5 or 6 inches at least, their antennae flicking, their bodies undulating. I felt my throat tighten. My chest locked up. And then, I realized they weren't just on the tent. They were falling. One by one, they dropped from the mesh, landing with soft, barely audible plops all around me. On my sleeping bag, my pillow, my face. I jerked upright, nearly slamming my head into the low ceiling. A centipede tumbled from my chest onto my lap, its legs squirming wildly before disappearing into the folds of my sleeping bag. I scrambled to unzip the tent, my fingers fumbling, breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The zipper caught for a moment, just long enough for more centipedes to drop onto my hands. Their bodies were surprisingly heavy, their legs sharp and prickly against my skin. I choked back a gag, wrenched the zipper down, and lunged out of the tent. The cold night air hit me like a wall, but I barely noticed. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my grip as I spun toward my tent. The ground around it was moving. It took my brain a second to process what I was seeing. The dirt, the rocks, the scattered leaves, everything seemed to be shifting, writhing, crawling. Centipedes. Dozens of them. Maybe more. Their slick, glistening bodies slithered over each other, legs twitching as they disappeared into the underbrush or scurried toward my abandoned tent. Some had already stopped moving, their bodies curled and still. But the majority were very much alive, and they were everywhere. I stood there, panting, my skin crawling in ways I'd never experienced before. I wanted to scream. I wanted to wake my friend, tell him to get the hell up, to see this, to help me process what the hell was happening. But he was still out, undisturbed, swinging gently in his hammock like nothing was wrong. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't even go near my tent. For the rest of the night, I sat by the smoldering remains of our campfire, my flashlight on, scanning the ground every few seconds. By morning, it was over. The centipedes were gone. Or at least, most of them. The only sign of the previous night's nightmare was the countless dead ones scattered around my tent like fallen leaves. I never figured out why it happened. We hadn't seen a single centipede before that night. Not during the hike. Not while setting up camp. Not while sitting on the cliff watching meteors. It was like they had just appeared. Like they had been waiting. We packed up quickly. My friend laughed when I told him what happened, shaking his head like I was exaggerating. Maybe I was. Maybe stress had made it seem worse. Maybe it hadn't been as many as I thought. But I'll never forget that feeling. The weight of them landing on me. The sight of them writhing in the light. The absolute, bone-deep disgust. And to this day, I can't sleep in a tent without looking up first. I don't know why I went alone. Maybe I wanted peace, maybe I wanted to challenge myself, or maybe I was just being stubborn. Either way, I packed up my gear, drove 3 hours into the mountains, and hiked 5 miles into the backcountry with nothing but my backpack, a tent, and enough food for 3 nights. The spot I picked was deep in the pines, far from any marked trail. I'd found it on a satellite map, an open patch near a creek, nestled between 2 ridges, with plenty of firewood nearby. It was perfect, or at least I thought it was. The first day went fine. I set up camp, gathered firewood, and cooked a simple meal. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridgeline, the air had cooled, and everything felt peaceful. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees and the steady trickle of the creek a few yards away. As night fell, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. I had planned this trip as a way to disconnect, to escape the noise of everyday life. Out here, it was just me in the wild. I had always been comfortable alone in the woods. But that night, for some reason, the silence felt different. I don't know when I first noticed it. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed too still, or how the usual night sounds, crickets, distant owls, seemed absent. But there was a weight in the air, something I couldn't quite place. I shook it off and crawled into my tent. The ground was hard, and I shifted in my sleeping bag, trying to find a comfortable position. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a light sleep. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me. It was a feeling. That sense you get when someone is standing too close behind you. I lay still, my heart pounding in my ears, listening. The fire had died down to embers, and the forest was black and silent. Then, soft, slow footsteps. Not an animal. Not the scurrying of a raccoon or the quick snaps of a deer moving through the brush. These were deliberate. Careful. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel the pulse in my neck. I told myself it had to be my imagination. Maybe a deer had wandered close. Maybe I had just dreamed it. Then the long, slow exhale. Right outside the thin layer of fabric separating me from the night. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The breath was steady, too steady to be an animal. It was close, inches from my tent. I could hear the soft rustling of fabric, like someone shifting their weight on dry leaves. I forced myself to stay still, to breathe as quietly as possible. I had a knife in my backpack, but it was out of reach. My bear spray was clipped to the tent wall, but I'd have to move to grab it. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, waiting. The breathing continued, slow, steady, almost measured. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. I stayed frozen, listening. Then, from further away this time, the sound of footsteps retreating into the trees. I waited, straining my ears, but I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, after what must have been an hour, exhaustion won over fear, and I fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, the forest seemed normal again. Sunlight filtered through the trees, birds chirped, the creek gurgled. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it all. But when I stepped outside my tent, I saw them, footprints, clear, human footprints in the dirt, circling my campsite. My stomach tightened. The prints weren't mine. I had been wearing hiking boots, and these were different. Too wide. I scanned the trees, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. Who the hell would be out here, barefoot in the middle of the night? I tried to shake it off. Maybe someone had been camping nearby and wandered too close. Maybe they were lost. Still, I packed my gear up a little tighter, kept my knife in my pocket, and made sure my bear spray was clipped where I could grab it in an instant. That night, I built my fire bigger, brighter, as if the flames could push back the unease creeping into my mind. I sat with my back to a tree, facing the fire, watching the dark. For hours, nothing happened. The wind picked up, rustling through the pines. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that I was alone. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again, breathing. But this time, it wasn't one breath. It was several, coming from different spots in the trees, just beyond the fire's glow. Long, slow, deliberate breaths. I gripped my knife. My hand was slick with sweat. The breathing stayed there, hovering at the edge of the firelight, surrounding me. Then, as if some unseen signal had been given, it stopped. Total silence. My fire crackled, the only sound in the stillness. I waited, my entire body tense. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against the tree, knife in one hand, bear spray in the other, staring into the woods. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I packed my gear as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I rolled up my tent. And that's when I saw them. More footprints. Dozens of them. All around my campsite. Some were pressed deep into the dirt, like someone had stood there for a long time. Watching. I didn't think. I just shouldered my pack and started walking. I didn't stop. Not to eat, not to rest. I walked for miles, practically running through the underbrush. Only when I reached my truck did I allow myself to breathe. I locked the doors, started the engine, and peeled out of there as fast as I could. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. I had worked at the summer camp for 2 months already, and by then, the routine felt second nature. The days were structured, the nights predictable. After the kids were in bed, we'd have late-night staff meetings in the main lodge, a large wooden building on a slight hill overlooking the campgrounds. It was meant to be a time to debrief, joke around, and prepare for the next day. But that night, none of us would be laughing. We were deep into the meeting when we first heard it. A sound so unnatural and out of place that my entire body tensed before I even registered what it was. It was faint at first. A high, thin wail carried through the trees. At first, I wasn't sure I had heard anything at all. I looked around at the other counselors, trying to gauge if anyone else had noticed. The meeting carried on for a few more minutes before the sound came again, louder, longer. A baby crying. It was unmistakable this time. There were no babies at the camp. The chatter in the room died instantly. We all sat in silence, listening. The sound came again, thin and weak, trailing off into nothing. I felt cold all over. The sound had come from the woods, beyond the cabins and down near the stream that ran along the outer edge of the property. Nobody said anything, but I could feel the shift in energy. Everyone had gone stiff, heads turning toward the windows. We were far enough from civilization that a crying baby in the woods wasn't just strange. It was impossible. After a long moment, a few of us stood up. We didn't discuss it, we didn't argue, we just moved. Something about the sound made it impossible to ignore. There were 3 of us who decided to go, me, a guy named Brandon, and another counselor, Jake. We grabbed flashlights from the supply shelf near the door. They weren't the best, cheap plastic with weak beams, but they were better than nothing. We didn't take anything else, just the flashlights and the clothes on our backs. We weren't thinking about what we might find. We were thinking about the sound. As soon as we stepped outside, the air felt different. The night had been warm earlier, but now there was a chill. I tried to shake the feeling of unease as we walked past the cabins, leaving the glow of the lodge behind. The further we got from the camp, the darker it became. The trees swallowed up the light, and the sounds of crickets and frogs faded into a heavy, pressing silence. We reached the tree line. Ahead of us, the narrow path wound its way down to the stream. The crying sound had stopped, but I still felt it, lingering like an echo in the back of my mind. Brandon led the way, his flashlight beam cutting a thin path through the dark. I followed close behind, my own light sweeping back and forth along the trail. The air smelled damp, thick with the scent of earth and wet leaves. We moved slowly, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. The further we went, the more uneasy I felt. I couldn't explain it, but something about the woods felt wrong. Then the smell hit us. A sharp, metallic scent. Blood. Brandon stopped so suddenly that I nearly ran into him. His flashlight beam flickered as he adjusted his grip. I could see his shoulders rise and fall as he took a breath. There, on the bank of the stream, was the source of the smell. A rabbit. It was lying on its side, its body ripped open. Blood pooled beneath it, soaking into the dirt, the water beside it running dark red. It was still moving, barely. Its legs twitched weakly, mouth opening and closing in silent pain. I stared at it, my stomach turning. Brandon swore under his breath. Jake exhaled sharply. I felt frozen. We had been expecting something weird, maybe some lost animal making a strange noise, but this was something else entirely. The rabbit had been butchered. At first, we thought it was a fox. It made sense. Foxes hunted small prey, and they weren't exactly clean killers. But the wound was wrong. It was deep, too deep for a fox's bite. The body looked torn rather than bitten, the flesh hanging in strips. It was dying. Jake muttered something about putting it out of its misery. I didn't argue. He told us to go back, that he'd handle it. Brandon hesitated but then nodded. I didn't want to be there any longer, so I turned and started walking back toward the lodge. We hadn't even gone 30 steps when we heard it. A rustling. A heavy movement in the trees. I turned back, heart hammering. My flashlight beam wavered as I swept it across the undergrowth. Jake was still crouched beside the rabbit. Then, everything happened at once. A sudden snapping of branches. A flash of movement. A blur of something large. Then Jake screamed. Not a shout, not a yell, asterisk, a scream star. It was raw, full of terror. He was running. I barely had time to process what was happening before he came barreling toward us, his face twisted in panic. His shirt and arms were covered in blood. We didn't wait to ask questions. We ran. I could hear something behind us, heavy footsteps crashing through the brush. I didn't dare turn around. My breath was ragged, my legs burning as we sprinted back toward the lodge. Jake overtook us, moving faster than I'd ever seen anyone move. The lodge came into view ahead, the glow of the windows like a beacon. We didn't stop until we were inside. The door slammed shut behind us. The meeting had just ended. The other counselors looked up in confusion, their expressions shifting to alarm when they saw Jake, covered in blood, panting like a wild animal. It took a while to get the full story out of him. Whatever had attacked the rabbit hadn't been a fox. It had been a cougar. A big one. It had been watching. Jake had only realized it was there when he saw the reflection of his flashlight in its eyes, just beyond the rabbit, half hidden in the undergrowth. It hadn't moved at first. Then, just as he was about to stand, it lunged. The only thing that saved him was the rabbit. In pure desperation, he had grabbed the bloody carcass and thrown it. The cougar went for it instead. That was why he was covered in blood. The camp was put on lockdown immediately. The rangers were called. They arrived in the early hours of the morning, armed and ready to track the animal. We didn't sleep that night. None of us did. By morning, the rangers had found fresh tracks circling the camp. The cougar had been closer than we thought. For the next week, all outdoor activities were canceled. The kids weren't told the full story, only that there had been wildlife activity near the camp. They never found the cougar. But the rangers told us one thing before they left. It hadn't been hunting the rabbit. It had been waiting, and we had walked right into its trap. I used to camp all the time when I was a kid. Growing up near the mountains, it was second nature to me, setting up a tent, building a fire, cooking over an open flame, and falling asleep to the sounds of the forest. But life happened. I moved away, got caught up in work, and before I knew it, over a decade had passed since I had last spent a night under the open sky. This was my first solo camping trip in over 10 years. I wanted to ease back into it, get familiar with the woods again, regain that comfort I used to have. Nothing extreme, just a night or two to remind myself of what I'd been missing. I didn't plan much, just packed my gear, filled up the tank, and set out. It was a long drive to my destination, and I got a later start than I wanted. The sun was already dipping toward the horizon by the time I reached the national forest. I knew I wouldn't make it to my planned campsite before dark, and I didn't want to be setting up in the pitch black. No big deal. That was part of the reason I brought my truck. If I needed to, I could just pull off on a forest road and sleep in the back. Simple. I turned onto a narrow dirt road that branched off the main gravel route. It was rough, barely maintained, but it led me deep into the woods, away from any signs of people. That's what I wanted: solitude, quiet, no distractions. After about 15 minutes of slow driving, I found a decent spot. A little clearing near a creek, flat enough to park without worrying about rolling in my sleep. The light was fading fast, the sky turning dusky blue with streaks of orange in the west. I killed the engine, stepping out into the cool evening air. The forest smelled exactly how I remembered it: pine, damp earth, and that faint, crisp scent of fall creeping in. It felt good to be out there again. I didn't bother with a tent. I had planned to sleep in the truck, so I pulled my sleeping bag and air mattress from the cab and started setting them up in the back. I was halfway through inflating the mattress when I noticed it. The silence. Not just the usual evening hush when birds settle in for the night. This was complete stillness. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of jays or woodpeckers. Just nothing. I stopped, holding my breath for a moment, listening harder. Nothing. That wasn't normal. I told myself it was fine, that maybe the animals had just quieted down as night fell, but something about it made my skin crawl. I had camped enough to know that forests don't go silent without reason. I pushed the thought aside, moving faster to finish getting my bed set up. Then I heard it. A sharp, rasping alarm call. A Stellar's jay. Close. Jays, crows, and ravens don't just call for no reason. They alert to things, predators, danger. My stomach clenched. I turned, scanning the trees where the sound had come from. And that's when I saw it. A shape. A shadow moving between two trees, low to the ground, maybe 30 feet away. It was fast but smooth, almost like liquid as it passed between the trunks. My first thought was deer, but something was off. The brush and the angle of the trees obscured most of it, but I caught a clear glimpse of the top of its hindquarters. Tawny colored. No tail. No head. Asterisk asterisk. I froze. My brain started running through possibilities, rationalizing. Maybe it was a deer. Maybe it was the angle. Asterisk asterisk. Then another thought hit me. It made no sound. That was wrong. The ground was thick with years of fallen leaves and pine needles. Deer crunch when they move through that. This thing had been silent. Dead silent. Only a predator moves like that. My stomach dropped. Mountain lion. I kept my eyes on the trees, heart pounding. From the direction it had been moving, it should have to cross the creek in front of me. I waited, expecting to see it emerge, to hear the splash of water as it passed. Nothing. The feeling of being watched crept over me, slow and suffocating. I hurried, shoving my sleeping bag fully into the truck bed, fingers shaking as I did it. The open space of the clearing suddenly felt exposed. Vulnerable. I slammed the tailgate shut. 3 huge bounds, heavy and unmistakable, thundered through the underbrush. Then, asterisk asterisk silence, asterisk asterisk. It hadn't run far. It had stopped. Watching. I didn't hesitate. I climbed into the truck, locking the doors in one motion. My breath was coming fast, pulse hammering in my ears. The cab felt small, the windows too open. I forced myself to slow my breathing, to listen. Nothing. The silence stretched. Oppressive. Suffocating. Asterisk asterisk. I knew mountain lions were ambush predators. They watch. They wait. The fact that I had seen it meant it knew I had seen it. That might have been the only reason it didn't come closer. Or maybe it was just waiting for the right moment. I stayed in that truck all night. I didn't sleep. Every sound, every crack of a branch, every whisper of wind through the trees, felt like something moving just out of sight. I kept imagining a shape slipping through the dark, circling, waiting. The hours stretched on. The night felt endless. Eventually, the sky began to lighten, turning deep navy, then pale gray. I waited, forcing myself to sit until the light was strong enough to see clearly. Then, slowly I reached for the door handle. I stepped out. The clearing was still silent. The air felt thick, heavy with the remnants of tension. I walked to where I had seen it, scanning the ground. My boots sank into soft earth, damp from the creek. Then I saw them. Tracks. Big, rounded pads. No claw marks. Asterisk asterisk, a perfect feline print. A shiver ran through me. It had been real. It had been so close. I didn't linger. I packed up, moving with purpose, forcing my hands to stay steady. The urge to look over my shoulder every few seconds was almost unbearable. When I finally got back in the truck and started the engine, the sound felt wrongly loud. I pulled out, tires crunching over gravel, and didn't look back. I had camped around bears before. I had heard wolves howling nearby. But nothing had ever made me feel like that mountain lion did. Hunted. Even now, years later, I still camp alone. But I never forget that night. And I never ignore the silence. Growing up in the deep woods, our idea of a camp out wasn't like what most people picture. We weren't miles away from civilization with nothing but a tent and a fire. We had the house nearby, with running water, electricity, and everything you could need, but that didn't stop us from pretending we were way out in the wilderness. Nights spent outside were filled with the usual camping traditions, roasting marshmallows, telling creepy stories, and daring each other to stay up as late as possible. But the best part was always the games. We played a lot of them, but the one we kept coming back to was manhunt. It was basically hide and seek in the dark, except the hunter had a flashlight, and everyone else had to use the cover of night to stay hidden. The only rule was that you couldn't cross back into the light of the house until the round was over. It was simple, thrilling, and just scary enough to keep our hearts racing. That night, the moon was out, giving us just enough light to see without completely tripping over ourselves, but it wasn't bright enough to make hiding impossible. The trees around our house were dense, and beyond the clearing where we set up camp, the woods stretched endlessly in every direction. We all knew them well, how the paths twisted, where the fallen logs made good hiding spots, and which patches of undergrowth were thick enough to crawl into without making too much noise. The game started the same way it always did. One person was chosen as the hunter and given the only flashlight, while the rest of us scattered into the woods, trying to find the best hiding places before the hunter finished counting. I was with 2 others that night, crouched low behind a thick tree trunk, just far enough from the house that the lights couldn't reach us. The air was cool, and the distant sound of crickets and frogs filled the silence. Somewhere behind us, closer to the house, the hunter called out, letting us know they were coming. We listened for the beam of the flashlight cutting through the trees, trying to gauge where they were moving. The trick to staying hidden was knowing when to move and when to stay completely still. Minutes passed. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps crunching leaves, slow and deliberate. The flashlight flickered through the trees, sweeping over the forest floor, but we were tucked far enough back that it never reached us directly. My heart was pounding, and I had to focus on keeping my breathing quiet. Then, something shifted behind us. It was subtle, a rustling sound, like leaves being disturbed by something moving. Not wind, not an animal darting through the underbrush. It was slow, deliberate, and close. At first, I thought maybe it was another one of our friends who had picked the same hiding spot, but that didn't make sense. Everyone had scattered when the round started, and we had been dead silent since. If someone else had crept up behind us, we would have heard them coming sooner. The sound came again. A shuffling of feet, the unmistakable crunch of dry leaves. Then, a flicker of light. Not from the hunter. The hunter was still up ahead, moving through the woods in the opposite direction. We had been watching their flashlight the whole time. This was behind us. For a second, I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The light wasn't steady like the hunter's. It flickered, shifting slightly like someone was adjusting their grip. And it was too low to the ground, as if whoever was holding it wasn't standing upright. Panic surged through me all at once. Without thinking, I bolted. The others didn't hesitate. They must have seen or heard the same thing I did because they sprang up right after me, and we tore through the woods, not caring about the noise we were making anymore. The only thought in my head was getting back to the house. Branches whipped against my arms as I ran, my feet barely touching the ground. I could hear the others just behind me, their breaths ragged and fast. The house lights were still far off, but I focused on them, using them as my target. Behind us, the sound of rustling leaves grew louder. I didn't dare look back. We burst into the clearing at full speed, our feet hitting the grass as we ran straight for the house. We didn't stop until we were standing in the full glow of the porch lights, panting and wide-eyed. The hunter was there, looking just as startled as we were. What the hell, they must have thought, seeing us all suddenly bolt out of the woods like we had seen a ghost. But there was no ghost. Nothing came out of the trees behind us. The rustling had stopped the moment we reached the clearing. The flickering light had disappeared. We stood there for a long time, staring back into the dark woods. I expected to see something, someone step into view, but there was nothing. Just the quiet sway of the trees, the distant hum of insects, and the moonlight filtering through the leaves. I told myself, even then, that it was probably nothing. Some other person, maybe a neighbor who had wandered too far, just as startled by our presence as we were by theirs. That had to be it, right? But the thing is, I knew these woods. I had spent my whole life running through them, playing games, exploring. There weren't any nearby houses, no trails that led close enough for some random hiker to stumble upon us. If someone had been out there, they were way off the beaten path. And why hadn't they said anything when we ran? If it had been a lost hiker, wouldn't they have called out? Asked for directions? Laughed at how scared we were? But no one did. For a while, we stood there, still catching our breath, waiting for something to happen. But the woods stayed silent. Too silent. Eventually, we convinced ourselves to move on. We made some nervous jokes about how we had probably scared some poor guy half to death, imagining the sight of 3 kids suddenly screaming and sprinting out of the woods. The others laughed, but it was uneasy, like none of us really believed it. We played again after that night. We never let one scare ruin our fun. But after that, I never hid that deep into the woods again. Not because I thought something would happen, but because I didn't want to feel that same sinking feeling in my stomach, that unnerving sense that we weren't alone. I never found out who or what was out there that night. Maybe it really was just some unlucky hiker. Maybe it was nothing. But I still think about that flickering light, the sound of leaves shifting just a little too close, the way my instincts screamed at me to run. I don't scare easy, but that night I ran like my life depended on it. I always liked camping alone. It gave me a break from everything. Work, my phone, the constant noise of people. Just me, the trees, and the sounds of the forest. It wasn't my first solo trip, and I had never been the kind of person to get scared easily. That weekend, I picked a remote spot deep in the pines of northern Montana. No campgrounds, no marked trails, just miles of dense forest. I had studied the map, checked the weather, and packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a GPS, a compass, and my knife. The plan was simple: hike about 10 miles in, set up camp by a small river I had marked on my map, spend a couple of nights there, and hike back out. The hike in was peaceful. The sky was clear, the air smelled like pine, and I could hear birds in the trees. The ground was soft under my boots, covered in a thick layer of needles. There was no real trail, just faint signs that animals had passed through. Every now and then, I checked my GPS to make sure I was heading the right way. By late afternoon, I reached the river. It was exactly as I had pictured: calm, shallow, with plenty of open space around it. I found a good flat spot near the water, cleared out some rocks and sticks, and set up my tent. After gathering some firewood, I built a small fire and cooked a quick meal. As the sun went down, the forest got quieter. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the occasional rustle in the trees, and the gentle flow of the river. I sat by the fire for a while, just staring into the flames, enjoying the silence. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and listened to the distant hoot of an owl before drifting off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. I just lay there, staring at the dark ceiling of my tent, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, and everything was quiet. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like something stepping on dry leaves. I stayed still, heart pounding. It wasn't wind. It wasn't a small animal. The steps were slow, deliberate. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. My other hand went to the flashlight. I took a deep breath, unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. Nothing. Just the trees, the river, the faint orange glow from the dying fire. I waited, listening. A minute passed. Nothing. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe it was just an animal passing through. I tried to shake it off, but my skin was still crawling as I lay back down. It took a long time to fall asleep again. By morning, the fear from the night before seemed silly. I stepped out of my tent, stretched, and went to relight the fire. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt near my tent. They came from the woods, stopped about 10 feet away from where I had been sleeping, then turned back. I stared at them, my stomach tightening. They were barefoot. No tread marks from boots, no signs of shoes. Just human-shaped footprints in the dirt. I scanned the tree-line, my pulse hammering in my ears. There was no sign of anyone. No sounds. No movement. I tried to stay logical. Maybe a hiker had wandered through. Maybe they saw my camp and turned back. But why barefoot? And why in the middle of nowhere? I spent the next hour circling my camp, looking for more signs. I found nothing. Whoever it was, they had come and gone in the night. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had come all this way, and I wasn't going to let a few footprints scare me off. Still, I kept my knife on my belt the whole day. The next night, I kept my fire bigger, letting it burn longer. The light made me feel safer. I stayed up late, listening, scanning the darkness. At some point, I thought I saw something, just a flicker of movement between the trees. But it was too quick, too far away. I told myself it was my imagination. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. By the third day, I had made up my mind to leave early in the morning. I wasn't going to risk another night. I spent the day gathering my things, keeping my knife close, trying not to let the silence get to me. As the sun started to set, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whistle. Not a bird. Not the wind. A human whistle. It was distant, coming from the trees, but I recognized the tune. It was the same one I had been absent-mindedly whistling earlier that day. A slow, mocking repetition. My hands went numb. I grabbed my bag, threw everything inside, and kicked dirt over the fire. I wasn't waiting until morning. I started moving fast, following my GPS back the way I had come. The sun was nearly gone, and the forest was getting dark. I walked fast at first, then faster. Then I heard it again. Closer. That same whistle. I broke into a run. Branches whipped against my arms and face. My breath came in ragged gasps. My boots pounded against the soft earth. Then, up ahead, I saw something move. A shape, barely visible in the last bit of light. Standing between the trees. It didn't chase me. It just stood there, watching. I ran harder. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of my truck through the trees. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking, threw open the door, and locked it the second I was inside. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the dark woods. Nothing moved. No sounds. No whistle. I started the engine and peeled out of there, not looking back. I don't know who or what was out there. I never went back to that spot. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I checked some online forums about that area. What I found still makes my skin crawl. Other campers had reported the same thing. Footprints around their camps, strange whistles mimicking their own, a figure watching from the trees. Nobody had answers. All I know is that I was followed. And whoever it was, they wanted me to know. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. 3 days in the wilderness, just me, my backpack, and miles of untouched forest. No cell service, no noise except for the wind through the trees, the distant call of a bird, or the occasional rustling in the underbrush. It was supposed to be peaceful, a reset from the constant noise of life. I had planned my route carefully, packed everything I needed, and set off early in the morning, my car the last thing tying me to civilization as I parked at the trailhead and locked it up. The first day went by exactly how I wanted. I covered nearly 10 miles, pushing myself hard to get deeper into the wilderness before setting up camp. The terrain was rough, old logging roads overgrown with saplings, sections of dense forest where I had to squeeze between trees, and a few steep hills that burned my legs on the way up. But it was worth it. By late afternoon, I had reached a small clearing near a stream, a perfect spot to set up my tent. I dropped my pack, stretched my sore shoulders, and got to work. The routine was familiar: set up the tent, unpack the sleeping bag, and gather enough firewood to last a few hours. I wasn't worried about big predators. This area didn't have grizzlies, just black bears, and they usually kept to themselves unless you were careless with food. I kept my campsite clean, hung my food in a tree away from my tent, and made a small fire to cook my dinner. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the temperature dropped, and the sounds of the forest changed. The birds quieted down, replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of nocturnal animals starting their nightly routines. I sat by the fire, eating slowly, letting the warmth soak into my bones. My legs ached from the hike and my shoulders were sore, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that made me feel like I had earned my rest. I stared into the fire, my mind wandering, letting the weight of everyday life slip away. Then I heard something. It was faint at first, almost covered by the crackling of the fire. A soft, rhythmic crunching sound, like footsteps moving through the undergrowth. I froze, listening. It could have been a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate. It wasn't the erratic movements of an animal sniffing around for food. It was slow, careful, like someone trying to move without making too much noise. I turned my head slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their trunks disappearing into blackness. The sound stopped. I held my breath, ears straining, waiting for it to start again. A minute passed. Then another. Nothing. Just the normal night sounds. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just on edge, my brain playing tricks on me after a long day. I let out a slow breath and turned back to the fire, pushing the unease away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to turn in early. I made sure my fire was properly out, double-checked that my food was secure, and crawled into my tent, zipping it up behind me. The fabric felt thin, too thin, like it wouldn't do anything to protect me if something, or someone, was out there. But I told myself it was just nerves. I had done dozens of solo trips before, and nothing had ever happened. I settled into my sleeping bag, listening to the quiet. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. At first, I didn't know why. The forest was silent, too silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no night sounds. Just an eerie stillness. Then I heard it again. The same soft crunching, moving closer. I lay completely still, my breath shallow. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They stopped just outside my tent. I could hear breathing, slow, steady, just beyond the thin layer of fabric separating me from whatever was out there. My mind raced. The bear? No, bears didn't move like that. The person? That thought was somehow worse. I reached slowly for the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag, gripping the handle tightly. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I fought to keep my breathing quiet. The breathing outside the tent stopped. I waited, every muscle tense. Then the sound of footsteps again, but this time moving away. Slow, deliberate, fading into the distance. I stayed frozen, listening until the sounds disappeared completely. I didn't move for a long time. My body screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but I knew that would be stupid. If it was an animal, I didn't want to attract its attention. If it was a person, running blindly through the dark would just make me an easy target. I had no idea where they had gone, or if they were still out there, watching. Eventually, the first hint of dawn light filtered through the trees, and I forced myself to move. My fingers were stiff from gripping the knife all night. I unzipped the tent slowly, peering out. The campsite looked the same. Nothing was disturbed, but when I stepped outside, I saw them, footprints in the dirt. Not animal tracks. Human. They circled my tent. I packed up as fast as I could, my hands shaking. I hadn't heard a second person, but that didn't mean much. Maybe whoever it was had been alone. Maybe not. Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I moved quickly, sticking to my planned route but keeping my pace fast. Every snapped twig, every rustling leaf made my heart jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone trailing me through the trees. But there was nothing. By midday, I had covered twice the distance I had planned. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I just wanted to get back to my car, back to safety. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was right where I had left it. No signs of anything unusual. No other vehicles parked nearby. I locked the doors the second I got inside, my hands still shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I pulled onto the road and headed home. I don't know who was out there that night. Maybe just some hiker who got lost and stumbled across my camp. Maybe something worse. But I do know one thing. Whatever it was, they had stood outside my tent for a long time, just listening. And I never heard them leave. Camping as a kid was always an adventure. It didn't matter if it was in someone's backyard, a state park, or deep in the woods. Every trip felt like stepping into something unknown. That summer, I went camping with a few friends near a place that ran rafting trips during the day. The area was supposed to be great for camping, with big open spaces for tents and a thick tree line for privacy. None of us had been there before, but one of my friend's older brothers had mentioned it, saying it was a solid place to stay if you wanted a quick getaway from the city. We arrived late, later than we'd planned. The sun had already set by the time we pulled up to the clearing, and by the time we got our gear out of the car, it was pitch black. The only light we had came from our flashlights and the faint glow of the stars above. It was the kind of darkness that made everything feel farther away than it really was. Even standing next to each other, it felt like we were miles apart. The night was warm but carried a slight chill, just enough to make me wish I'd brought an extra layer. From the moment we stepped out of the car, there was a sound. A deep, rushing, rustling noise that filled the air around us. It was constant, not stopping for even a second, like wind rushing through dry leaves. But there was no wind. The trees weren't moving. The sound came from all around us, like it was wrapping itself around the clearing. It wasn't exactly frightening, but it was strange. It felt unnatural, even though it was probably something simple, some kind of weird echo from the valley, maybe. We didn't stop to think much about it. We were tired from the drive, and our main goal was to get the tent up and get some sleep. Setting up camp in the dark was frustrating. The ground was uneven, and the beams of our flashlights only illuminated small patches at a time, making it hard to tell what we were doing. We found a relatively flat spot near a few large trees and figured it was good enough. The sound was still there, that never-ending rustling, but by then I was too focused on getting the tent up to care. Once the tent was finally standing, we threw our sleeping bags inside and climbed in. The air was cool and damp, and the scent of dirt and leaves filled the space. I lay there for a while, listening to the noise outside. It didn't change, it just kept going, an unbroken roar of leaves. Eventually, exhaustion won over curiosity, and I drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It took a moment for me to remember where I was. The tent was dark, the air inside stuffy and warm from all of us breathing. The sound outside was still there. It felt even louder now, pressing against the fabric of the tent. I needed to pee. At first, I tried to ignore it. I was comfortable, and getting up meant stumbling around in the dark, dealing with the cold air, and possibly waking up my friends. But after a few minutes, I knew I couldn't hold it. I moved carefully, trying not to make noise as I unzipped my sleeping bag and shifted toward the entrance. My flashlight was next to my bag, but I decided to leave it. If I turned it on, the light would fill the tent and wake everyone up. I figured I didn't need it anyway. I had walked around earlier while setting up camp. I knew what the ground felt like. As long as I stayed close to the tent, I'd be fine. I slipped outside. The night air hit me immediately, cold and damp against my skin. The sound was louder than ever. It was strange standing in it, feeling the stillness of the air but hearing the rush all around me. It really did sound like leaves in the wind, but there was no movement, nothing but darkness and the faint shapes of trees against the night sky. I walked a little farther from the tent, just a few steps, then a few more. I wanted to make sure I was far enough away that no one would complain in the morning. The ground was soft but solid under my feet. I could feel small twigs snapping as I stepped, and occasionally my foot would land on a patch of damp leaves, making a quiet squishing sound. I went about my business quickly, shivering slightly in the cold air. As I stood there, staring into the darkness, I felt a small, nagging sense of unease. Something about the sound bothered me, but I still couldn't put my finger on why. I finished up, turned back toward the tent, and walked back the way I came. At least I thought I did. For a moment, I felt a flicker of doubt. The tent should have been right in front of me, but I didn't see it. I stopped walking, listened. The sound was still everywhere, filling the silence. The air was thick, damp, heavy. I turned slightly, scanning the darkness. Then, just as I was about to take another step, I noticed something. A patch of space just a little darker than the rest of the night. The outline of the tent. Relieved, I made my way back and crawled inside, still careful not to wake anyone. I lay down, pulling my sleeping bag around me, and let my breathing slow. The rustling sound outside continued, but I ignored it. Within a few minutes, I was asleep again. Morning came slowly. Light seeped through the thin fabric of the tent, casting a dull gray glow inside. The air felt damp and cold, the way it always does right before the sun fully rises. I stretched, yawned, and pushed myself up, unzipping the tent to step outside. The moment I did, I froze. The sound was still there, but now I finally understood what it was. The river. Not the wind. Not rustling leaves. The sound that had surrounded us all night was the rushing water of the river, just a few feet away from where I had stood in the dark. I turned my head slowly, looking to my right, and there it was. A fast-moving, deep river cutting through the trees, so close that I could have thrown a rock into it without much effort. The current was strong, the water dark, churning over unseen rocks below the surface. Look deep, deadly. I felt my stomach twist. I had walked out here in the dark, without a flashlight, without seeing where I was going. If I had wandered just a few steps further, if I had lost my footing, I wouldn't have had a chance. The river would have taken me in an instant, pulled me under before anyone even realized I was gone. I stared at the water, my heart hammering against my ribs. The thought of how close I had come to serious danger hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't something dramatic, like a wild animal or a masked figure in the woods. It was something so simple, so easy to miss. A river just beyond the trees. I felt sick. I turned back to the tent, swallowed hard, and sat down on a fallen log nearby, trying to shake off the feeling. I had learned my lesson. Never again would I leave the tent without a flashlight. Never again would I assume I knew where I was just because I had seen it in daylight. Some things didn't give second chances, and I had almost learned that the hard way. I don't think I've ever been more exhausted in my life. Even now, thinking back on it, I can still feel that deep, aching fatigue in my bones, the kind that settles in after pushing yourself too hard for too long. I had no choice though. I had to keep moving. It started out as a solo trip, just me, my pack, and a 3-day stretch in the backcountry. I had done plenty of camping before, but this was my first time going completely alone. It was supposed to be peaceful, a chance to disconnect from the constant noise of life. No phone, no people, just the sound of wind through the trees and the steady crunch of dirt under my boots. I picked a trail deep in the national forest, a place where few people went. It was out of the way, rugged, with long stretches of dense pine forest and narrow, winding trails that weren't always well marked. The kind of place where you could walk for hours without seeing another soul. That was the appeal. The first day went fine. I set up camp near a small creek, filtered some water, cooked a simple meal, and watched the stars. The air was cool, the forest quiet except for the occasional chirp of insects and rustling leaves. I was completely alone, and I liked it that way. The second day is when things went wrong. I had planned to hike deeper into the forest, following an old logging road that I had marked on my map. It wasn't an official trail, but I had read about it in an online forum, an overgrown path that wound through thick pines, leading to an abandoned fire lookout on a ridge. The plan was to camp near the lookout that night, then hike back the next morning. I never made it there. The logging road was rough, barely recognizable as a path in some places. Fallen trees blocked parts of it, and I had to climb over them or push through thick underbrush to keep moving. I was making good progress until I came across a set of tracks in the dirt. They weren't boot prints. At first, I thought they might be from a large dog, big, deep impressions, scattered along the path. But as I looked closer, I saw claw marks, longer and sharper than any dog's. My stomach tightened. These were bear tracks. I glanced around, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. The usual sounds of birds and insects had faded. The trees stood still, the air heavy. I had read enough to know that surprising a bear, especially if it had cubs, could be a death sentence. I tightened my grip on my trekking pole and stepped carefully, scanning the trees for any movement. I kept walking, slower now, listening for anything unusual. My heart was pounding. I told myself that the tracks weren't fresh, that the bear was probably long gone. Then I saw the tree. It was stripped bare, deep claw marks raking down its trunk. Fresh. The wood underneath was pale, the bark scattered at the base. My mouth went dry. Bears mark trees like that to assert territory. It wasn't just passing through. It was here. I turned back. There was no hesitation. I wasn't going any farther. I moved quickly but carefully, retracing my steps. Every snapped twig made my skin crawl. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I was being watched. My only goal was to get back to my previous campsite before dark. But I never did. Somewhere along the way, I took a wrong turn. Maybe I was moving too fast, not paying close enough attention. Maybe the faint trail I had followed had forked without me realizing. Whatever the reason, after an hour of hiking, I knew I was lost. The trees all looked the same, tall, dark pines stretching in every direction. There were no trail markers, no familiar landmarks. My map was useless without a reference point, and my compass told me I was heading west when I should have been going east. I stopped to get my bearings. I needed to stay calm, think rationally. The smart thing to do would be to set up camp and wait for daylight. Night was coming fast, and stumbling through the woods in the dark was asking for trouble. I found a small clearing and set up my tent. I forced myself to eat, even though I wasn't hungry. Every sound made me flinch, branches creaking, leaves rustling, distant animal calls. And then, just as I was settling into my sleeping bag, I heard it. A low, guttural sound. Not a growl exactly, but something deep, vibrating through the trees. I froze, my hand tightening around my knife. My fire had burned low, casting only weak flickers of light. The sound came again, closer this time. My brain screamed bear, but something about it was different. It wasn't the short, sharp grunt of a black bear. It was deeper, heavier, almost deliberate. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The sound moved, circling the edge of my campsite. Not crashing through the underbrush like a startled animal, but slow, methodical. I reached for my flashlight, but the second I turned it on, the sound stopped. Silence. The forest held its breath. I swept the light across the trees, my pulse hammering. Nothing. Just empty woods. Then I heard a twig snap behind my tent. I spun around, shining the light, but whatever was there had already moved. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up, knife in hand, listening to whatever was out there. It never came into my campsite, but it never left either. It stayed just beyond the firelight, shifting through the trees. Watching. At first light, I packed up and left. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just wanted to move. I walked fast, pushing through exhaustion, following the slope of the land downward, hoping it would lead me to a road or a stream. Hours passed. My legs burned. My water ran low. But eventually, I stumbled onto a dirt road. I followed it until I saw a parked truck. A man loading gear into the back looked up as I approached. "You all right?" he asked, eyeing my disheveled state. I nodded, too drained to speak. He offered me a ride back to the main road. I didn't tell him what happened. What could I say? That something had followed me in the woods? That I still felt its presence even now, standing in the daylight? I just thanked him and got in. When I got home, I checked the maps again, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong. The logging road I followed wasn't on any official records. The fire lookout I had been searching for didn't exist. And the place where I had camped? It wasn't far from where, years ago, a hunter had gone missing. His camp had been found abandoned, tent slashed open, gear scattered, no signs of an animal attack. Just gone. I don't camp alone anymore. We hadn't planned to camp this deep into the forest. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just a few nights at a designated campground, some hiking, a bit of fishing, and time spent around the fire. But when we arrived, we found that the campground was completely full. Every single spot was taken, the lot packed with cars, kids running around, families grilling burgers at picnic tables. It wasn't the peaceful escape we had in mind. One of my friends suggested we try a more remote spot. We had all the gear to rough it, plenty of food, a reliable tent, and a car packed with supplies. It sounded like a good idea at the time. We checked the map and found an area deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest designated camping spot. It would take a bit of a drive and a short hike, but it would give us the quiet, secluded experience we were looking for. By late afternoon, we had set up our tent in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The trees stretched high, their branches thick enough to block most of the sky. The air was damp, carrying the smell of moss and earth. It was quiet, too quiet. I remember thinking that as we finished setting up, No birds, no wind, just stillness. But I brushed it off. We were deep in the forest. That was normal, right? That first night, we cooked hot dogs over the fire and passed around a bottle of whiskey. We laughed, swapped stories, and enjoyed the peace of being away from the crowds. Around midnight, we crawled into our sleeping bags, the warmth of the fire still lingering in the air. I fell asleep easily, comfortable in the darkness of the tent, with my friends sleeping nearby. Then, at around 2 in the morning, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. It wasn't like a noise had startled me awake, but something felt wrong. I stayed still, listening. That's when I heard it. Drumming. Faint, rhythmic, distant, but getting louder. A steady, deep thumping sound, like hands beating on stretched hide. Then came the singing. It wasn't like any song I'd ever heard before. The voices were layered, rising and falling in a way that made my stomach twist. It was beautiful in a way, but something about it made me feel off. Not scared, exactly, but deeply unsettled. Like I was hearing something I wasn't supposed to hear. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my breath shallow. I could hear my friends shifting, waking up too. No one spoke, but I knew they heard it. It was impossible not to. The strangest part was that the sound wasn't coming from any one direction. It was all around us. The drumming, the voices, they filled the air like the forest itself was singing. Every part of me told me that something was wrong. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. We were miles from the nearest road, deep in the wilderness. For what felt like hours, we sat there, frozen, listening. The music didn't stop. It didn't move closer, didn't fade away. It just was. Finally, unable to take it anymore, we grabbed our sleeping bags and climbed into the car. We locked the doors, curled up in the back seats, and forced ourselves to wait until dawn. I didn't sleep. I don't think any of us did. The next morning, the forest was silent again. No drumming, no voices. The air felt lighter, like whatever had been there the night before was gone. We walked around looking for any sign of people, footprints, a fire pit, anything. But we saw nothing. No broken branches, no cleared spaces where someone might have camped. Nothing. We tried to shake it off. Maybe it had been the wind. Maybe there had been other campers nearby, and we just hadn't seen them. The rational explanations felt thin, but they were all we had. That night, we decided to stay again. I don't know why. Maybe we didn't want to admit we were scared. Maybe we wanted to prove to ourselves that it had been nothing. At around 2 in the morning, we woke up again. The music was back. This time, it was louder. It was the same drumming, the same voices, but closer now, pressing in around us. My skin crawled. The feeling was worse this time, like my body knew something was wrong even if my mind couldn't explain it. I stayed completely still in my sleeping bag, every muscle tense. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but the looks on my friends' faces told me they were hearing it too. For hours, we lay awake, listening. The sound didn't fade. It didn't move. It just stayed, surrounding us. We didn't go to the car this time. We were too scared to move. The moment the sun came up, we packed everything as fast as we could. We didn't speak much. We just moved, stuffed our gear into our packs, took down the tent, and hiked back to the car. We didn't stop until we reached the main campground. That night, we stayed in a proper campsite, surrounded by other campers. Nothing happened. No drumming. No voices. Just the normal sounds of a campground, crackling fires, distant laughter, the occasional bark of a dog. I don't know what we heard out there. I don't have an explanation for why the sound was everywhere and nowhere at once. I don't understand how we saw no signs of anyone else in the area. But I do know that my best friend, who is Navajo, told me later that the music sounded just like the songs she had heard in tribal ceremonies. She didn't have an explanation either. Even now, thinking about it makes my skin crawl. I've been camping plenty of times since then, but I've never camped that deep in the forest again.
I don't know if I'd call myself an experienced camper, but I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something isn't right. I've been on plenty of hikes, taken solo trips, and handled my fair share of unexpected situations, but this one stuck with me more than any other. It was the closest I'd ever come to realizing just how small I was out there, just how quickly things could go from normal to dangerous. This happened a few years ago when I took a solo camping trip in a national forest. It was meant to be a quick weekend getaway. Just me, my pack, and the quiet of the woods. I had planned a simple out-and-back route, nothing crazy, just a few miles in, a night to myself, and a hike back the next morning. I wasn't looking for an adrenaline rush, just a break from everything. The trail I picked wasn't the most popular, which was part of the appeal. I wasn't interested in bumping into other hikers every few minutes, and I liked the idea of having some real solitude. The first few miles were exactly what I wanted. Just the sound of my boots on dirt, birds in the trees, and the occasional rustling of something small moving through the underbrush. The deeper I went, the quieter it got, and that's when I started to feel it. Something was off. It wasn't anything obvious. No sudden noises, no feeling of being watched, just a nagging sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought I was. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just my mind adjusting to the isolation. That's the thing about being out in the woods alone. Your brain has a way of playing tricks on you, making every little sound seem bigger than it is, every shadow just a little darker than it should be. I pushed on, setting up camp a little before sunset in a clearing not far from a small stream. It was a good spot, flat ground, plenty of space, and enough cover from the trees to block the wind. I built a fire, made some food, and settled in for the night, letting the warmth of the flames and the quiet of the woods relax me. But that feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. Every so often, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees for something I couldn't name. There was no obvious reason for it. No snapped twigs, no shifting shadows, just an unease that I couldn't shake. It was the kind of feeling that settles deep in your gut, the kind that tells you something isn't right even when everything looks normal. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. But when I finally crawled into my tent and zipped myself in, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake. I wasn't scared exactly, but I wasn't comfortable either. I told myself it was just nerves, the isolation messing with me, and eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. It wasn't because of a noise or a bad dream. I just woke up like my body knew something wasn't right before my mind did. I lay there, listening, my ears straining for any sound beyond the normal night noises. At first, everything seemed normal. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig as some small animal moved through the underbrush. But then I heard it, breathing, not mine, not the soft, rhythmic sounds of some small animal. Something else. It was slow, steady, controlled. Close. I held my breath, listening, waiting. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from. It wasn't right outside my tent, but it wasn't far either. I felt frozen, my mind racing through possibilities. A deer? A bear? Person? None of them made sense. The breathing was too measured, too deliberate. I listened for what felt like forever, my entire body tense, every muscle locked in place. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was gone. Silence. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Just the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there, listening, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. The night stretched on, slow and endless, until finally, the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. I didn't waste any time. As soon as there was enough light to see, I broke camp, packed up my gear, and started back toward the trailhead. I wasn't panicking, but I wasn't wasting time either. I wanted to be out of those woods before I had to spend another night in them. The hike back should have been easy, just retracing my steps, following the same trail I had taken in. But somewhere along the way, I took a wrong turn. I don't know when it happened. I was moving fast, not paying as much attention as I should have, and at some point, I veered off the main trail without realizing it. It wasn't until the path started to narrow, the trees pressing in closer, that I realized something was wrong. I stopped, checked my map, my compass, tried to get my bearings, but nothing looked right. I wasn't where I was supposed to be. Panic started to creep in at the edges of my mind, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't lost, not really. I just needed to backtrack, find the main trail again. I turned around, retracing my steps, looking for anything familiar. But the more I walked, the more I realized I had no idea where I was. The woods all looked the same. Every tree, every rock, every fallen log. It all blended together, and no matter which way I turned, I couldn't find my way back. Then I heard it again. The breathing, slow, measured, deliberate. But this time it wasn't behind me. It was ahead. I stopped, every muscle in my body tensed, my pulse hammering in my ears. I scanned the trees, searching for movement, for any sign of what was making that sound. But there was nothing. Just trees and shadows and the overwhelming sense that I was not alone. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, listening. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, the breathing faded, swallowed by the silence of the woods. I ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just ran, pushing through branches, stumbling over roots, my only thought to get out, to get away. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I didn't stop. I ran until my body couldn't take it anymore, until my legs gave out and I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. And then I saw it. Footprint. Not mine. Not a boot. Bare feet. The breath left my lungs in a shudder, my mind racing, trying to process what I was seeing. The print was fresh, pressed into the damp earth, the toes digging slightly into the dirt as if someone had been standing there, watching. I didn't wait to find out who it belonged to. I forced myself to my feet and kept moving, slower this time, more controlled, listening to every sound, watching every shadow. I walked for what felt like hours until, finally, I saw it, the trailhead, my car, the road beyond it. I don't think I've ever moved faster in my life. I didn't stop until I was inside my car, the doors locked, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I sat there, staring out into the trees, half expecting to see something or someone, standing at the edge of the woods. But there was nothing, just trees, just silence. I never went back to that trail. It started as one of those perfect spring days in Colorado. Mid-March, and after weeks of snow and mud, the weather had finally warmed up enough to open up more of the trail. I had been waiting for this, training for my attempt to ride the entire Colorado Trail later that year. This was my 5th or 6th trip out, and I had the solo routine down to a science. Pack the gear, double-check everything, make sure I had my layers in case the temperature dropped overnight. Set out early enough to cover ground, but not so early that I'd burn myself out before setting up camp. This time was no different. From my apartment in Littleton, I rode out, following familiar roads until I reached the trailhead. It was always strange how quickly the city could fall away. 45 minutes of pedaling and I was already deep in the forest, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of my tires crunching against dirt. The ride up was perfect. The trail was dry, birds were chirping, and the single track was in the best condition I'd seen all season. I passed Bear Creek, feeling good, when I noticed something odd up ahead. A full suspension trek was leaning against a tree. That alone wasn't too unusual. A lot of riders took breaks along the trail, but I didn't see anyone near the bike at first. Then I heard it, sharp, rhythmic sawing. I kept going and eventually spotted the source of the noise. A guy, maybe mid-50s, with long brown hair and a flannel shirt, was cutting through a downed tree with a handsaw. He looked like he knew what he was doing, methodically working his way through the trunk, clearing the path. He noticed me and waved. I stopped. It was clear he had been at it for a while and he was almost done. The polite thing to do was help, so I leaned my bike against a tree and helped him move the cut sections off the trail. It was heavy work, but between the two of us, we cleared it quickly. We got to talking, just normal mountain biking stuff, gear, trails, plans. He asked where I was heading. I told him, without thinking too much about it, that I was new to the Colorado Trail. that I was still testing my gear, getting used to solo camping, that I wasn't carrying a gun, but I had bare mace and a knife. In retrospect, I shared way too much. At the time, he seemed genuinely interested, like a guy who had been doing this for years and was just excited to see someone getting into it. As we wrapped up, he mentioned a great campsite about half a mile ahead, said it was sheltered by cliffs, had a fire pit, and overlooked Waterton Canyon. I thanked him and rode on. The spot was exactly where he said it would be. A perfect clearing with a small, stone-lined fire pit, shielded from the wind by the cliffs. It was too good to pass up. As I was setting up, I found the tools he'd mentioned. A waxed canvas bundle tucked under a ledge. Inside was a hatchet, a handsaw, a hammer, and some other small tools. They looked well used but maintained. It was a small thing, but it made me feel like I had some extra security. Like I wasn't completely alone. I gathered firewood, cooked my meal, and ate by the fire as the last light faded. The air was unseasonably warm. No wind, just the crackling fire and the sounds of the woods settling in for the night. I'd gotten used to the nerves that came with sleeping alone in the backcountry. The first few trips had been rough. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind, had me wide awake, gripping my knife. But I'd learned to manage it. Earplugs helped. Blocked out the little noises so I could actually sleep. That night, something woke me up. Not a noise. Not exactly. It was more like a feeling. A jolt of fear so strong that I was fully alert before I even knew why. The fire had burned low, leaving only faint embers glowing inside the pit. The night was still. No wind, no rustling, nothing. I stayed completely still, listening. Nothing. Slowly, I reached for my headlamp, flicking it on as I unzipped my tent. The light swept over the trees. Shadows stretched long and thin, moving as I turned my head. Nothing. I grabbed my bare mace in one hand, my fixed blade knife in the other, and stepped out. I listened. Still nothing. The fear hadn't left. It was still there, pressing in on me, making my skin crawl. I pulled the pin on my personal alarm. The sharp, 130 decibel scream shattered the silence, echoing off the cliffs. Nothing ran. Nothing moved. I stood there, waiting, my breath loud in my ears. The fear didn't fade. It only deepened. Something was out there, something that didn't scare easily. I forced myself to move, to start packing. Bike packing meant everything had to be secured properly. No throwing stuff in the car and peeling out. Took time. Too much time. My hands felt clumsy, fumbling with straps and buckles. My back was to the trees the whole time. I kept my headlamp on, sweeping it over the tree line every few seconds. Nothing, but the feeling never left. 15 minutes later, I was on my bike, heading out. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe my brain had just decided to freak me out for no reason. I was about a mile in when I heard it. Something walking, 4 feet to my right. Close. I stopped. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see anything. The trees were too thick. I yelled, loud and aggressive. Nothing. Then twigs snapping. A shift of weight. It wasn't running. It wasn't scared. It was watching. I started moving again, pushing myself up the incline. The sound followed. Whatever it was pacing me. I was halfway up the steepest climb before Lenny's Rest when I finally heard it break into a run. Not away, towards me. It was fast. Too fast. Adrenaline kicked in. I pushed harder, lungs burning, legs screaming. Lenny's Rest was just ahead. A launch pad, nothing but steep, winding downhill all the way back to the trailhead. I made it, stopped for half a second to catch my breath, and then crashing footsteps, racing up the hill behind me. I didn't wait. I launched myself downhill, hitting speeds I had no business reaching in the dark. Switchbacks, cliffs, loose gravel, I didn't care. I had to get out. Halfway down, I had to slow at a rocky section. As I did, I heard it again, crashing through the trees above me. Whatever it wasn't following the trail. It was cutting straight down the mountain. I didn't stop again. I hit the bottom, the water road stretching ahead, wide and clear. I didn't stop pedaling until I reached Wadsworth Boulevard. streetlights glowing like a lifeline in the distance. I rode all the way home. I never saw it, never knew what it was, but something was out there that night, and it followed me. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe I just wanted to be alone for a while. Maybe I thought getting away from everything would help me clear my head. Maybe I was just tired of feeling like shit every day. Whatever the reason, I packed up my car one morning and drove 4 hours into the middle of nowhere, heading toward a stretch of public land along the Mississippi River in Illinois. It wasn't an actual campground, just a patch of wilderness managed by the Army Corps of Engineers. Free to camp on, no reservations, no rules. Just me, the trees, the water, and whatever I could fit in my trunk. It was late afternoon by the time I pulled off the highway, following a long, empty road that turned into a dirt trail leading toward the river. The trees were thick, mostly oak and hickory, but every so often I caught glimpses of the water through gaps in the branches. The place felt completely isolated, which was exactly what I wanted. No people, no noise, just me and the wild. I found a good spot near the riverbank, a flat clearing with a few fallen logs I could use as makeshift seats. The ground was damp but solid, and the trees were spaced out enough to give me a decent view of the water. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I killed the engine, got out, and just stood there for a while, breathing in the damp, earthy smell of the woods. After unloading my gear, I gathered some wood and started a fire. The flames crackled and popped, sending up little sparks into the evening air. I didn't bring much food, just some rice, beans, and a couple of cans of soup. The plan was simple: eat, sleep, and let my body work through the withdrawals in peace. No distractions, no temptations. But then the rain started. At first, it was just a few light drops, barely enough to notice. Then it got heavier, turning the dirt beneath my feet into slick mud. I put out the fire, set up my tent as fast as I could, and crawled inside, zipping the flap shut behind me. The sound of rain tapping against the fabric was strangely soothing, and after a while, I drifted off to sleep. Sometime later, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The rain had stopped, and everything outside was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it, a soft shuffling sound, like footsteps moving through the wet grass. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. There, standing barely 10 feet away, was a man. He was staring right at me. His face was rough, covered in scars, or maybe some kind of skin disease. His beard was patchy and uneven, and his clothes looked like they'd been worn for years without washing. His hair was matted, his hands dirty, but despite how he looked, he didn't seem threatening. He was just there, watching. I hesitated, then stepped out of the tent. The air was cold and damp, and the ground squished under my bare feet. The man didn't move, just tilted his head slightly as if studying me. Behind him, a small fire flickered, casting long shadows against the trees. He smiled. The whole situation should have terrified me, but for some reason, it didn't. He seemed almost childlike, excited to see another person. We stood there in silence for a moment before I noticed his bicycle leaned against a tree nearby. It was covered in snake skins, their dried, scaly bodies woven around the frame like some kind of bizarre decoration. I sat down on a log near his fire, and he sat across from me. He started talking almost immediately, his voice low and raspy, rambling about survival, about the things he'd learned living out here. His words tumbled out in a chaotic mess, jumping from topic to topic without warning. He talked about trapping animals, about skinning them, about how he believed eating them gave him their strength. He pulled out a bundle of hides, showing them off like they were prized possessions. I listened. He was strange, no doubt about it, but there was something fascinating about the way he spoke. He wasn't just surviving out here. He had made this place his home. He knew every inch of the land, every trick to getting food, water, and shelter. He showed me his cooking setup, his tools, the way he boiled river water to make it safe to drink. In some twisted way, he was probably one of the most knowledgeable people I'd ever met when it came to living off the grid. But the more he talked, the more unsettling it got. At one point, he started rambling about how he absorbed the energy of the things he killed. At first, I thought he was just talking about animals. But then he said something that made my skin crawl. He talked about raping to steal energy. I sat perfectly still, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just heard. His words were jumbled, erratic, but I knew what he meant. He wasn't just talking about animals. I felt my stomach tighten. He kept talking like it was nothing, like he was just sharing another survival tip. His face was unreadable, his tone casual. I forced myself to stay calm, nodding every so often, pretending I was still interested. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but I knew I couldn't just get up and walk away. Not yet. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the campsite. I glanced at the pile of knives he had shown me earlier, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't sleep knowing he was this close. I took a slow breath and forced a smile. "I need to run into town," I said, standing up and stretching like it was no big deal. "I forgot to bring cigarettes." His eyes lit up. He had been asking me for one all day, even though I told him I didn't smoke. He grinned, nodding eagerly. I turned and walked toward my car, keeping my pace steady, not too fast, not too slow. My hands were shaking as I gripped the door handle, but I kept my face neutral. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the campsite. I didn't stop driving until I crossed the river into Iowa. I ended up in some small town called Clinton, parked near a casino. My hands were still trembling as I stepped inside, wandering aimlessly through the bright, noisy rooms. I lost $5 at a slot machine without even thinking about it. My mind was somewhere else entirely. Eventually, I found a park and parked my car next to a playground. I was exhausted but too wired to go home. I leaned back in the seat and let my eyes close, letting the distant sounds of the town lull me into an uneasy sleep. I woke up to the sound of children playing. For a brief moment, everything felt normal again. The sun was shining. The world was moving on as if nothing had happened. I sat there, watching the kids run around, their laughter ringing through the crisp morning air. And then I started my car and drove home. I never went back to that campsite, never checked to see if he was still there. I didn't want to know. A few summers ago, me and a few of my buddies decided to spend the night catfishing at a local reservoir. This was in rural Ohio, miles from anything significant, the kind of place where the nights were so dark you couldn't see your hand in front of your face without a fire or a flashlight. We had fished this reservoir dozens of times, and we had never once run into another person out there at night. It was quiet, secluded, and the perfect spot for a few cases of beer, some big catfish, and an all-nighter by the water. The reservoir itself fed a tiny village of about 1,500 people, a speck on the map. It wasn't a tourist spot, it wasn't particularly scenic, and if you didn't live in the area, you wouldn't even know it existed. The main road leading to it was gravel, but we didn't want to be anywhere near that. Technically, alcohol wasn't allowed near the water, and the last thing we wanted was to get caught up with some overzealous game warden looking to make an example of a few guys drinking by a lake. So instead, we took the long way around. There was an old service road, barely even a road anymore, that looped around the far side of the reservoir. It was all compacted dirt, tree roots breaking through in places, deep ruts from erosion, and spots where fallen trees had been left to rot for years. It was completely impassable for a regular vehicle, but we all had lifted 4x4s and Jeeps, so we weren't worried. We wanted to be as far away as possible from the main entrance, and this road let us do just that. After a slow, bumpy ride, we finally reached our spot. It was a little peninsula of land that stretched out into the reservoir, teardrop-shaped, maybe 20 feet out into the water. That gave us water on 3 sides, which meant we could spread out and cast in different directions, avoiding tangled lines. Plus, someone had already been out there before us at some point. There was an old fire pit and even a decent pile of leftover wood. No need to go searching for kindling. By the time we parked the trucks and got our gear unloaded, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. It was warm, sticky, the kind of thick summer air that made you sweat even when you weren't moving. We cracked open our first beers, got the fire going, and baited our lines. The night was perfect. For a few hours we sat around, drinking, talking, laughing, and pulling in fish. The water was still, not a single ripple beyond what we made. The stars were out, no wind, no bugs. Just one of those nights where everything felt right. Then the fog rolled in. At first, it was just a light haze creeping across the surface of the water. But within minutes, it thickened into a dense wall of mist, swallowing the far side of the reservoir completely. We could still see our fire and each other, but beyond that, nothing. It was like we were floating in a bubble, cut off from the rest of the world. Then we heard it. KRSPLOSH. The sound was loud, deep, like something heavy had just been dropped into the water across the reservoir. It was unmistakable, not a fish flopping, not a frog jumping. This was big. We turned, watching the water. The fog was so thick we couldn't see the far shore, but we saw the ripples moving toward us, spreading out in slow, concentric circles. We figured it was a tree limb falling in, or maybe a beaver jumping off the bank, though, did beavers even jump? Either way, we laughed it off and went back to fishing. Then it happened again. KRSPLOSH. Louder this time, closer. The ripples spread out toward us again, cutting through the fog. At this point, we started looking at each other. That was no coincidence. Something or someone was out there making those sounds. But why? Still, it was easy enough to rationalize. A tree falling, maybe, or some big animal. Something natural. So we ignored it. An hour or so passed, and the fire started burning low. We were running out of wood. One of the guys stayed back to watch the poles while the rest of us fanned out into the trees to gather more firewood. We all took different directions, figuring it would be faster. I wandered a little deeper than I meant to, my flashlight bouncing through the underbrush. I was just about to turn back when I spotted something in the dirt. A boot. It was just sitting there, half covered in leaves. Rubber, like the kind you'd wear if you were working in a swamp. I nudged it with my foot. Empty. Weird. I grabbed a few more sticks, then turned back toward the fire. As I walked back, I saw one of my buddies ahead of me, carrying something under his arm. When we all got back to camp, he tossed his haul onto the ground. A white jacket, pair of rubber boots, and a clown mask. We all just stared at it for a second. Now, this was around the time when people were posting about those scary clowns lurking around towns trying to freak people out. I had always thought that was just dumb internet bullshit. Still, seeing that mask sitting there in the firelight, it didn't feel like bullshit, but we laughed it off. Some kids probably had a party out here and left it behind. No big deal. Then we heard it again. Twigs snapping across the water. Then **KRSPLOSH. That was it. We weren't alone out there. Someone was watching us. We called out, saying we weren't looking for trouble, just fishing and drinking some beers. If they wanted to come hang out, they were welcome. Silence. We called out again. Nothing. At this point, the mood had shifted. A couple of the guys were genuinely freaked. The mask, the boots, the fact that someone was just standing out there, not answering, just watching us. I, on the other hand, had that drunk confidence. I convinced two of my buddies to come with me and check it out. The others stayed behind to watch the camp. We made our way through the brush, the fog swirling around our legs. As we walked, we started seeing trash. Empty cans, old food wrappers. Then saplings that had been cut down. More trash. Then we found the footprints. Bare feet. We stopped. Who the hell was wandering out here barefoot? The ground was covered in sticks, thorns, sharp rocks. There was no way someone just happened to be walking around out here like this. Then we saw it. A tent. Old. Covered in moss. Half collapsed. There was trash all around it. And then the propane tanks. Not one or two. Pile. 15, 20 of them. The big 5-gallon ones. I felt my stomach drop. I turned to the guys and said, "Welp, I guess this is none of my business." And we booked it. Back at camp, we didn't waste time. We threw everything in the trucks, killed the fire, and got the hell out of there. As we were leaving, we pulled onto the main dirt road. A shitty little Toyota Camry passed us going the other way, packed with 5 guys. They turned down the service road we had just come from. We kept driving. Looking in the rear view, I could see their taillights disappearing into the trees. We had just stumbled onto a meth lab. Whoever was out there had been trying to scare us off by throwing shit in the water. And when that didn't work, they called backup. If we had stayed 5 more minutes, we might not have made it out. We never went back. We weren't supposed to be out there like that. Not in the middle of nowhere, underprepared, running on exhaustion, and with no real plan other than walk until we find help. It had been an ordinary trip at first, just me and 7 friends out in the vast emptiness of rural Australia, camping in a place so remote that even the most well-traveled backroads looked like nothing more than faint scars across the landscape. But something happened back at camp. Something that forced us to pack up in a hurry and leave. I don't even remember whose idea it was to hike to town, but it was our only option. There was no cell service, no way to call for help, and no working vehicle to get us out of there. The nearest town was at least a full day's hike away, and we barely had enough supplies to last us until morning. I had my flashlight, a nearly empty water bottle, and a few granola bars in my pack. Everyone else had similar supplies, just whatever we'd managed to grab before heading out. The hike started fine. The air was warm, probably around 25 degrees Celsius, and the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dirt trail. It was one of those narrow, uneven 4x4 tracks, probably used by local farmers or off-roaders. We stayed close together, talking here and there, but mostly just walking in silence, conserving energy. As the hours stretched on, the sky deepened into a dark shade of blue, then black. And when I say black, I mean pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallows everything whole. The only light came from the sky, where the stars burned violently bright, so vivid they almost didn't seem real. Out there, far from any city, they weren't just scattered pinpricks but full-on constellations glowing like neon against the void. The Milky Way stretched across the sky in a thick, silver haze, and for a moment, it was almost beautiful, almost peaceful. But the deeper we went, the more things felt off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. The way the trail looked different under the dim light, as if the shadows were shifting when I wasn't looking. The way the air seemed too still, too thick, like walking through some invisible current. The way my own footsteps sounded wrong, like they were being swallowed up too fast by the silence. Then we came to the clearing. It wasn't big, just a small break in the trees where a narrow stream cut through the dirt, winding its way towards some unseen destination. The water was clear, trickling gently over smooth rocks, barely making a sound. It was the kind of place that, under normal circumstances, might have been nice, peaceful even. We sat down by the water, taking the chance to rest and drink. I splashed some on my face, feeling the cool relief of it against my skin. That's when it hit me, that feeling. It wasn't fear, not at first. More like anticipation, like that split-second rush of nerves before stepping on stage in front of a massive crowd, when your stomach twists itself into knots and your heart pounds a little too fast. A weird, fluttery sensation that had no reason to be there. I glanced at the others. Am I the only one feeling weird right now? That's what I wanted to ask. But I didn't have to. I could see it on their faces. No one moved. No one spoke. But the way they were looking at each other, at the trees, at the stream, I knew they felt it too. And that's when we saw them. Further down the stream, just beyond the bend, the air seemed to shimmer. A faint glow flickered between the trees, soft at first but growing brighter, more defined. First, I thought it was fireflies. Then I thought maybe our eyes were playing tricks on us. But no, there were hundreds of them. Little orb-like things, each glowing in a strange, pulsating rhythm. Some were pale blue, others a deep, rich orange, others a soft, unnatural green. They hovered just above the ground, drifting lazily in the air like embers caught in the wind. They didn't move like bugs. They didn't move like anything I've ever seen before. We just sat there, watching, too mesmerized to do anything else. I could feel my own breathing slow, my thoughts narrowing to a single point of focus. Asterisk, asterisk, them, asterisk, asterisk. I don't know how long we stared, but at some point, the glow started to fade. The colors dimmed, flickering out one by one until only the dark remained. That's when the real fear set in. It wasn't gradual. It was like a switch flipped inside my head. 1 second, I was caught in that strange, trance-like state, and the next, I was drowning in dread. Not normal fear. Not, I think I'm in danger fear, but the kind of fear that makes you feel like you're already dead. Asterisk, asterisk. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, stuck in place by something I couldn't name. My hands went ice cold. My stomach lurched. My skin prickled with goosebumps so intense they almost hurt. I looked at my friend. Her face was wrong, pale, hollow, like every ounce of warmth had been sucked out of her. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, locked on something unseen, and she wasn't breathing. None of us were. I don't know how long we sat there, paralyzed. Could have been seconds, could have been minutes. But when one of us finally moved, when that spell finally broke, we all moved. We ran. No words, no hesitation. Just pure instinct, screaming at us to get the hell out of there. The clearing blurred past us, the trees morphing into a dark tunnel as we sprinted down the trail. My chest burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. The feeling didn't fade. It clung to me like a second skin, like something unseen was right behind us, reaching for us, waiting for one of us to fall. My breath came in ragged gasps, my vision swam, but we did not stop running. Not until the first hints of dawn touched the sky. Only then, when the world was no longer wrapped in darkness, did we slow down. Only then did we dare to breathe. The fear didn't vanish, not completely. It lingered, humming beneath the surface like an aftershock. Even when we reached town later that morning, exhausted, dehydrated, barely able to process what had happened, we didn't talk about it. Not then, not ever, because what could we even say? There were no answers, no explanations, just a feeling, one that had burned itself into our bones, one that still lingers even now. And even now, all these years later, I still can't shake the thought. We weren't supposed to see that, and whatever saw us that night hasn't forgotten. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. It wasn't my first solo camping trip, but it was my first time heading deep into the backcountry alone, pushing myself further than before. I had planned everything down to the smallest detail, mapping out my route, checking the weather, and packing my gear with precision. The goal was to hike into a secluded valley, camp by a river for a few nights, and then loop back out before the weekend ended. The first 2 days went perfectly. The trail was challenging but manageable, winding through thick forests and cutting through steep ridges. The valley I had picked as my campsite was breathtaking, thick with towering pines and carpeted with damp moss, the river cutting through like a silver ribbon. I set up my tent on a dry patch of ground a little higher than the waterline, cooked a simple meal, and let the quiet settle in. But by the third day, everything changed. It started with the rain. The forecast had mentioned the possibility of rain, but nothing serious, light showers at most. That wasn't what I got. By mid-morning, dark clouds had rolled in, heavy and low, swallowing the valley in shadows. The wind picked up, pushing through the trees with an eerie moaning sound. The rain came not as a gentle drizzle, but as a sudden, hammering downpour. Within minutes, I was drenched. My rain gear helped, but only so much. I told myself it would pass. Storms moved fast through valleys like this, but as the hours stretched on, the rain didn't ease. If anything, it worsened. The sound of raindrops hitting the tarp over my tent was deafening, like thousands of tiny drumbeats crashing all at once. Water pooled around my campsite, turning the ground into thick, sucking mud. By the time the sun should have been setting, I realized I had a bigger problem. The river was rising. I had chosen my campsite carefully, making sure I was on higher ground, but even that wasn't enough. The river had swollen, creeping up its banks with alarming speed. What had been a peaceful, slow-moving stream the day before was now a raging, foamy current. I grabbed my headlamp and stepped out into the rain, trying to judge how much time I had. The answer was clear. ***, not much. ***. I had to move. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, shoving everything into my backpack without bothering to organize it. My fingers were numb from the cold rain, making even simple tasks frustratingly difficult. The tent was soaked and heavy, but I didn't have a choice. I had to carry it with me. My original plan had been to stay in the valley for another night, but now that was impossible. The trail I had used to get here followed the river upstream, and I had a bad feeling it was already underwater. That left only one option: climb. There was a ridge to the west, not far, but steep. If I could make it up there, I'd be safe from the rising water. I didn't hesitate. I slung my pack over my shoulders and started moving, pushing through the underbrush, my boots sinking deep into the mud. Every step was a struggle. The rain made everything slick, and the steep incline only made it worse. I had to grab onto roots and branches to keep from slipping backward. Halfway up, I glanced back. The river had already swallowed my campsite. The place where I had been standing minutes before was now part of the flood. My stomach tightened. If I had waited any longer, I would have been trapped. I forced myself to climb faster. My legs burned. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. The higher I got, the safer I'd be. Then I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. A deep, rumbling crack. The ground beneath me shifted. It wasn't immediate, but slow, like something waking up. The rain had loosened the soil, turning it into a thick, unstable mass. And now it was moving. Before I could react, the slope beneath me gave way. For a split second, I felt weightless. Then I was falling. I hit the ground hard, rolling uncontrollably as mud, rocks, and water tumbled with me. My pack slammed into my back, nearly knocking the wind out of me. My arms flailed, trying to grab onto anything, but everything was sliding with me. The world spun. Then impact. Everything went black. I woke up with my face pressed against wet ground, my body half buried in mud and debris. My head throbbed, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or how I got there. Then it all rushed back. The storm, the river, the landslide. I forced myself to sit up. My body ached all over, and my clothes were soaked through. My pack was gone. It must have been ripped away during the fall. I looked around. The slope above me was a mess of churned up earth and broken trees. I had slid at least 50 feet down, landing in what looked like a shallow ravine. Worse, the river had changed course. The water was now surging directly toward me. I had no food, no shelter, no way to call for help, and I was trapped. I had no choice but to move again. My only chance was to climb out of the ravine before the floodwaters reached me. Every movement was agony, but I pushed through, clawing my way up the muddy slope. My fingers dug into the wet ground, my muscles screaming in protest. Took what felt like hours. The rain never stopped, the cold seeping into my bones. I lost track of time, my mind focused only on one thing: survive. Finally, I reached the top. I collapsed onto solid ground, gasping for breath. The storm still raged around me, but I was above the flood now. I wasn't safe, not completely, but I had a chance. I spent the rest of the night huddled against a fallen log, too exhausted to do anything else. My body shook from the cold, but I didn't dare sleep. The darkness stretched on forever. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the storm, I could see just how bad the damage was. The valley was almost unrecognizable. The river had swallowed everything. My campsite was completely gone. Even the trees along the bank had been ripped away. I knew I couldn't stay there. With no gear and no supplies, I had no choice but to start walking. I didn't know exactly where I was, but I knew that if I kept moving west, I'd eventually hit a road or a trail. My body protested every step, but I forced myself to keep going. Hours passed. Then, through the trees, I saw something, a wooden signpost, a trail. Relief flooded through me. I wasn't out of danger yet, but I wasn't lost anymore. If I followed the trail, it would lead me back to civilization. By midday, I heard the distant sound of a car engine, and then, finally, people. I stumbled onto a dirt road, waving weakly as an approaching truck slowed to a stop. The driver, a man in a raincoat, jumped out, his face a mix of shock and concern. I had made it. I never went back for my gear. It was lost to the flood, buried somewhere beneath the river. Took days for my body to recover. Weeks before I stopped waking up in the middle of the night, dreaming of the storm. But I had survived, and that was enough. The Santa Barbara backcountry is one of those places that feels untouched, like a hidden corner of the world where time slows down. My friends and I had been hiking for 2 days, making our way deeper into the wilderness along a narrow, winding trail that cut through dry chaparral and clusters of towering oak trees. It was late fall, and the air had that crisp, clean scent that only comes when the heat of summer has finally broken. Nights were cold, mornings chilly, but the days were perfect, warm enough to be comfortable, cool enough to keep the bugs away. We'd set up camp in a clearing not far from a small stream, about 10 miles in from the trailhead. It wasn't an official campsite, just a flat spot with enough space for our tents and a fire pit we'd built out of rocks. There was no one else around. We hadn't seen another hiker since the first day, and even then, it was just a couple heading the opposite direction, already on their way out. That was part of the appeal of these trips. No cell service, no noise from the city, just the quiet of the backcountry and the occasional rustling of animals moving through the brush. Our last morning, we took our time packing up. None of us were in a hurry to start the long hike back. We had a small fire going, heating up the last of our food, some oatmeal, a few pieces of jerky, coffee made from instant packets that tasted like burnt dirt but did the job. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the ground, and a thin layer of mist clung to the trees. That's when we heard them. Voices. At first, we didn't think much of it. Hikers, maybe, or another group of campers. But the more we listened, the stranger it seemed. The voices were coming from the hillside above us, somewhere up the trail we had come in on. 2 men talking in low, deliberate tones. The thing that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up was the fact that they weren't getting closer. The sound wasn't growing louder, the way it would if someone was hiking toward us. They were staying put, watching. I stopped what I was doing and glanced at my friends. They'd noticed too. We all went quiet, listening. The voices carried on for a while, sometimes breaking into laughter, sometimes mumbling just low enough that we couldn't make out the words. It was impossible to tell what they were talking about. But one thing was clear, they weren't just passing through. They were sitting up there, watching our camp, either not realizing we could hear them or not caring. We didn't say anything to each other. We just kept packing up like normal, acting like we hadn't noticed. My stomach felt tight, though. There's something unsettling about knowing you're being watched, especially that deep in the wilderness. It's different from running into strangers on the street. Out here, there's no quick escape, no easy way to remove yourself from a situation if things go sideways. An hour passed. Eventually, we heard movement, footsteps on the trail. The voices got louder, and then, finally, the 2 men appeared. They walked in like they owned the place, both middle-aged, both carrying rifles slung over their shoulders. The shorter one led the way, stepping off the trail and heading straight toward us. He had a stocky build, a thick, graying beard, and a kind of gruff confidence that suggested he didn't second-guess himself often. The taller one followed a few steps behind, lean, silent, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his faded baseball cap. I tried not to let my posture change, tried to keep my hands moving as I packed, but my pulse had picked up. The short one spoke first. "So, what kind of weed you guys smoking?" His voice was rough, casual, but there was an edge to it, something just a little too direct. We had been smoking. It wasn't exactly a secret, but I didn't like the way he asked, like he already knew the answer and just wanted to see how we'd react. One of my friends shrugged and played it off. Oh, just swag. But we just finished it off. The man grinned and reached into his shirt pocket, pulling out a small pipe. Well, we'll just have to smoke mine then. My friends hesitated, but then, one by one, they each took a hit. I passed. I didn't like the situation, didn't like the fact that we were suddenly entertaining two armed strangers in the middle of nowhere. The whole thing felt too deliberate. The short man eyed me, then pulled his backpack off his shoulders and tossed it at me. "Hold this," he said. I caught it out of reflex. It was heavier than I expected, the weight uneven, shifting as I steadied myself. That's when I noticed the blood. There was a slow but steady drip coming from the bottom, dark red against the dirt. "How much you think that weighs?" the man asked. I swallowed. "I don't know. Maybe 35, 40 pounds. He grinned. "Damn right." He gestured at the antlers poking out from the top of the pack. "We butchered the deer in the backcountry. Easier to carry the meat that way." I wanted to set the bag down immediately, but I forced myself to stay still, to not let them see that I was uneasy. I handed it back without a word. That's when they introduced themselves. The short one was Ralph. The tall one, the quiet one, was Keith. They'd grown up in Santa Barbara, had been hunting these mountains since they were kids. Every year, they met up for a hunting trip, a tradition they'd kept alive for decades. Keith, it turned out, had married a district attorney. Ralph had moved up to the mountains near Yosemite, married a nice fat woman who baked, and spent his days inspecting power lines in the wilderness. The longer they talked, the less threatening they seemed. Still strange, still unpredictable, but not necessarily dangerous. Maybe just two guys who lived in a different world than we did. Eventually, they shouldered their packs, gave us a nod, and headed back up the trail. We waited a good 10 minutes after they disappeared before speaking again. "That was weird," one of my friends muttered. No one disagreed. We finished packing in silence, strapped on our packs, and started the long hike back to the car. The whole way out, I kept thinking about that hour before they showed up. The way their voices had carried down from the ridge. The way they'd watched us without making their presence known. Maybe they had just been resting, deciding whether to come down. Maybe they hadn't meant anything by it. Or maybe they had. We never saw them again. Camping had always been my escape. No matter how stressful life got, the woods were my way out. I liked being alone out there, far from the noise of cities, where the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the distant calls of birds. I didn't take unnecessary risks, though. I always packed carefully, carried a satellite phone, and let someone know where I'd be. But this trip was different. It was the first time I genuinely felt unsafe in the woods. I had planned a solo camping trip in a remote part of the national forest, somewhere off-trail where I wouldn't run into people. I parked my truck at a small gravel pull-off along an old logging road, shouldered my pack, and started hiking. The terrain was rough. Uneven ground covered in loose leaves and hidden roots that threatened to trip me if I wasn't careful. My destination was a small clearing I had marked on my map, about 5 miles in. The first few miles were uneventful, just the steady rhythm of my boots crunching through the underbrush. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The trees grew thicker, the light dimmer. I liked that. It was peaceful. But as I neared my campsite, I started noticing little things that unsettled me. First, there were the trees. Several of them had deep claw marks raked down their trunks. I had seen claw marks before, but these were fresher than I was comfortable with. Then there was the silence. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping birds, rustling squirrels, had gone still. I stopped walking, listening, but I couldn't hear anything but the faint wind. I tried to shake it off. Sometimes forests got quiet for no reason. Maybe an animal had passed through recently, and the smaller creatures were being cautious. I kept moving and finally reached the clearing. It was perfect. Flat ground, enough space for my tent, and a small stream nearby for water. I set up my tent quickly, laid out my sleeping bag, and got a fire going. As the sun dipped below the trees, the forest remained eerily quiet. The fire crackled, sending flickering shadows across the trees. Something about that night felt different. I had camped alone plenty of times, but there was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't shake. I ate my dinner quickly, listening. Nothing. No rustling leaves, no distant owl calls. Just silence. Then I heard it. A low, steady crunch of footsteps. Not the scurrying of an animal, these were slow, deliberate steps. My heart started pounding as I reached for my flashlight. I swept the beam through the trees, but there was nothing there. Just the empty forest. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer. Maybe my imagination. But I didn't feel right. I put more wood on the fire, the extra light making me feel a little safer. But I didn't sleep well that night. Every little noise made my nerves jolt. By morning, I felt foolish for how uneasy I had been. The forest was back to normal. Birds chirping, squirrels chattering. I packed up my camp and decided to explore the area before heading back. I wandered deeper into the woods, keeping track of my bearings. The terrain got rougher, with thick brush making it hard to move. Then, I found something that made my stomach drop. A small clearing, almost perfectly round, where the grass had been flattened, as if something heavy had been lying there. A pile of bones sat nearby, picked clean. I moved closer and saw deep scratches in the dirt, like something had dug into the ground. A predator's resting spot. I had no interest in finding out what kind of predator. I turned back, moving faster now. But as I made my way toward camp, I heard movement behind me. Not footsteps exactly, something heavier, shifting through the underbrush. I stopped, heart pounding. The noise stopped too. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing, but I knew something was there. I moved faster, forcing myself not to break into a run. Running triggered predators. I didn't want to seem like prey. I made it back to my camp, grabbed my gear, and started heading out. The feeling of being watched never left me. Every so often, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. A shape shifting between the trees, never close enough to see clearly. 2 miles from my truck, I heard it again. A low, steady breathing. Close. Too close. I didn't look back. I just walked faster, forcing myself to stay calm. The trail ahead felt endless. My body screamed at me to run, but I held back. Then, I heard the sound that nearly made me break. A deep, guttural exhale. It wasn't human. It wasn't a bear either. I had no idea what it was. I gripped my knife tightly, my fingers slick with sweat. The truck was still too far. If whatever was following me decided to attack, I wouldn't have time to react. And then silence again. I forced myself forward, trying to control my breathing. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I almost collapsed with relief. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, and climbed inside, locking the doors. I sat there for a long time listening. Nothing. Finally, I started the engine. My headlights illuminated the trail ahead, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of my lights, something stood there, not moving, just watching. I couldn't make out its shape. My eyes refused to focus on it, like my brain didn't want to process what I was seeing. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I hit the gas, kicking up dirt as I sped down the road. I didn't look back. I never camped in that part of the forest again. I was never afraid of the woods. I grew up camping, hiking, and fishing, spending entire summers deep in the backcountry with nothing but a tent and a fire. I liked being alone out there. The woods had their dangers, but they were familiar: bears, snakes, storms. Things you could prepare for, things that made sense. But what happened that weekend? I wasn't ready for that. It started as a solo backpacking trip in the mountains, a 3-day loop through a remote stretch of national forest. It was early fall, the best time to go: cool nights, crisp mornings, no bugs. I planned to follow an old logging road, then drop into a narrow gorge where a river cut through the hills. The trail wasn't well traveled, but I had a good map and plenty of experience. The first day was perfect. I parked at a small trailhead, shouldered my pack, and started hiking just before noon. The woods were quiet, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. The old logging road was overgrown, but easy to follow, winding through dense pine and oak forests. I made good time, covering about 8 miles before setting up camp on a ridge overlooking the gorge. I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and watched the sun dip below the trees. The silence out there was different, deep, absolute. No distant highway noise, no planes overhead. Just wind in the branches and the occasional crack of a settling tree. I slept well, waking only once to an owl's call echoing through the valley. The next morning, I packed up and started down into the gorge. The descent was steep, the trail barely more than a game path, twisting through thick underbrush and loose rock. My goal was to reach the river by noon, follow it upstream for a few miles, then camp in a clearing marked on my map. But as I got deeper, something felt off. At first, it was subtle. The forest got too quiet. No birds, no insects, just my footsteps crunching on dry leaves. Then there was the smell, something rotten, faint but distinct, carried on the breeze. It wasn't a dead animal. It was different. I shook it off and kept moving. The river wasn't far. But then I saw something that stopped me cold. A boot, just one, half buried in the dirt beside the trail. Weathered, cracked, old. The laces frayed and broken. I nudged it with my foot, expecting it to be empty. It was, but the way it sat there, alone in the middle of nowhere, set my nerves on edge. I looked around, scanning the trees. Nothing. I told myself it was just trash, maybe left by a careless hunter. But I picked up my pace, eager to reach the river and put some distance between me and that spot. When I finally made it to the water, I felt better. The gorge opened up, the river wide and shallow, clear enough to see smooth stones beneath the surface. I filled my bottle, ate a quick lunch, and kept moving upstream. The map showed a clearing not far ahead, flat ground, a good place to camp. But when I got there, I stopped short. The campsite was wrong. It should have been an open space, but it was a mess. Trees fallen in odd directions, their trunks split and shattered. The ground was torn up, gouged deep like something had been dragged through the dirt. There was no sign of a fire ring, no footprints, nothing to suggest people had been there recently. Then I saw the second boot. It lay at the base of a tree, half hidden in the roots. Same as the first, old, cracked. But this time, I noticed something else. Bones. Not a lot, just a few scattered in the leaves. Small ones, maybe from a deer. Maybe. The unease I'd felt all day turned to something heavier. I had no reason to be scared. There was no proof of anything bad happening here. But every instinct told me to leave. So I did. I turned around, heading back downstream. It was late afternoon now, and I'd have to find another place to camp. The map showed a second site a mile or so back. Higher ground, safer. I walked fast, keeping my eyes on the trail. But after 10 minutes, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The first boot. The same boot I'd passed earlier. That wasn't possible. I hadn't turned around, hadn't crossed my own path. But there it was, half buried in the dirt. I stood frozen, heart pounding. I knew I hadn't gone in circles. I checked my compass, pulled out my map. Everything should have made sense. But it didn't. The sun was sinking, the shadows growing long. I needed to get out of the gorge before dark. I forced myself to move, sticking to the river, pushing through the undergrowth. Then, ahead of me, movement. Not an animal. A shape stepping between the trees. I stopped breathing. It was far off, just at the edge of sight, but I saw it clearly. A figure, tall and thin, moving slow. Deliberate. Not lost. Not wandering. Watching. My blood ran cold. I turned and walked faster, resisting the urge to run. Running meant panic. Running meant noise. But every step, I felt it. An unbearable pressure at my back. The feeling of eyes drilling into me. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the gorge's edge, the last light was fading. I scrambled up the rocky slope, every muscle burning, lungs screaming. I didn't stop until I was back on the ridge where I'd camped the night before. Only then did I look down. The gorge was empty, dark, silent. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my knife close, staring into the trees, waiting. Nothing came. The first light, I packed up and left. I hiked hard, barely stopping, pushing through exhaustion until I reached my car. The second I hit the road, I locked the doors and drove without looking back. I don't know what I saw down there. Maybe nothing. Maybe my mind playing tricks. But I do know this. When I got home, I checked my map again. There was no second campsite, no clearing upstream, and that logging road, it hadn't been used in over 50 years. I was born and raised deep in the woods, not just near them, not on the outskirts of town where the trees start to thicken, but fully immersed in them. My home sits on a 50-acre plot of land my father bought back in the 70s, surrounded by over 900 acres of state forest, with another 3,000 acres of national forest stretching beyond that. It's the kind of place where you don't hear cars or neighbors, only the sound of wind through the trees and the distant howls of coyotes. Most people don't understand what that kind of isolation feels like. They think of camping trips or weekend hikes, where the silence is refreshing, a break from city noise. But when you live in it, the quiet isn't always comforting. It breathes differently at night, presses against you, heavy and watchful. I've seen things out here, things I can't explain, things that don't make sense. Not ghosts, not monsters, nothing that belongs in a horror movie. Just events that defy reason. I've spent my entire life out here. I know these woods better than I know most people. I know where the old stone foundations sit, remnants of settlers long gone. I know where the unmarked graves lie, bodies buried deep beneath layers of leaves and moss, their markers long since eroded. There are staircases built into hillsides that lead to nothing, as if someone started building a home and gave up, leaving only the steps behind. Animals out here are different too. Bobcats, bears, deer, and mountain lions are common, but it's the coyotes that stand out. Their packs aren't small, scattered groups like you'd expect. They're huge, 15 to 40 strong. Sometimes they mix with feral dogs, creating something meaner, wilder. I've seen coy dogs out here, bigger than normal coyotes, their eyes less afraid of humans than they should be. I've even seen a badger once or twice, which is rare in this area. Most of the time, I feel safe. The land is mine, after all. My family has lived here for decades. But there are moments, fleeting, unshakable moments, where I know I am not alone, even when I should be. The first time something happened that I couldn't explain, I was sitting in my living room with some friends. We were just hanging out, nothing strange about the night. One of my buddies had set his metal water bottle on the table in front of us. We weren't paying attention to it. There was no reason to, until it jumped, not tipped over, not nudged. It lifted 2 feet straight into the air, hovered for half a second, then came crashing back down into the exact same ring of condensation it had left behind. No one said anything. No one moved. Then, all at once, we scrambled out of the room like scared kids. We tried to rationalize it later, air pressure, vibration from something outside, maybe even one of us messing around. But none of those explanations made sense. The way it moved was too deliberate, too controlled. A year or so later, something else happened. Another night with friends over, this time playing video games in the living room. The house was full of noise, laughing, shouting at the game, the soundtrack playing through the speakers. Then the game froze, not just a normal freeze where the screen locks up. The sound cut out mid-note, an unnatural silence filling the room. We all went quiet, waiting for the game to catch up. That's when we heard it. Water, a faucet running, full blast. It was coming from the kitchen. No one had been in there. We hadn't used the sink in hours. There was no reason for the water to be on. I walked over, stomach tight, already knowing what I'd find. The faucet was turned all the way, water pouring into the basin. I shut it off. I checked the pipes later, thinking maybe it was a pressure issue. Nothing. No leaks, no signs of malfunction. It had just turned on. The house has a problem with lights. It doesn't matter how many times I fix the wiring, replace fixtures, or even run separate circuits from different breaker boxes. One bulb in any given fixture will refuse to light. It's not always the same position, not always the same room. But if a light fixture has 3 bulbs, one won't work. If it has 2, only one will light up. I've tested everything. Swapped bulbs, rewired connections, even checked the electrical panel for faults. Nothing explains it. It's not just the lights either. Electronics have a mind of their own. TVs, stereos, computers, they turn on and off at random. Always when I'm not looking. I'll leave a room, come back, and find a TV that was off now blaring static. Or worse, I'll turn something off, walk away, and hear it flicker back on behind me. It doesn't happen when I'm watching, only when my back is turned. The land holds history. Some of it is documented, some of it is just whispers passed down through the years. There are old smuggler dens hidden within the hills, forgotten hideouts from an era long gone. The state hiking trails cut through our property due to bad mapping, leading strangers onto our land. I don't like that, not because I'm worried about people, but because I know they don't belong here. A 2-mile hike in any direction will bring you to something abandoned. Collapsed foundation, an unmarked grave, a staircase that leads to nothing. I've never seen a ghost. I don't believe in them, but I've felt something, a presence, a weight in the air. Not watching, not threatening, just there. I don't tell people about this, not because I'm scared, but because they wouldn't believe me. One night I was out in the woods alone. It wasn't unusual. I knew the land well and didn't think twice about taking late walks. I had my flashlight, my knife, and a solid understanding of where I was. I was about a mile from the house when I heard something behind me. Not footsteps, not an animal. Breathing, heavy, steady breathing. I turned, expecting to see a deer, maybe a bear, but there was nothing, just trees and darkness. I stood still, listening. The breathing moved, not away from me, not toward me, but around me, circling, shifting between the trees. I backed up slowly, flashlight sweeping the woods. Nothing moved, nothing changed, but I could still hear it, just beyond the edge of the light. I don't scare easy, but that night, I turned and walked back home without stopping. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I just left. When I got home, I locked the doors. Not because I thought something was going to follow me inside. Because for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was the only thing living out here. I've never felt threatened. Never felt like I was in danger. But I have felt that I was not alone. I don't have answers. I don't need them. This is my home. And whatever else is out here, whoever else is out here, there's 2. I had always wanted to do a solo camping trip. Just me, the woods, and nothing else. It was something I had planned for a while, but I kept pushing it back. There was always some excuse, work, weather, life getting in the way. But finally, one fall weekend, everything lined up. I had time off, the forecast was clear, and I told myself there was no reason not to go. The place I chose was a remote spot deep in the national forest, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. I had scouted it out months ago, marking it on my map as the perfect place to camp undisturbed. No cell service, no people. Just a dense stretch of towering pine trees, a narrow creek running nearby, and miles of wilderness in every direction. I packed everything I needed. My tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, a knife, bear spray, a headlamp, extra batteries, and enough food for 2 days. I made sure my car was in good shape before leaving. Even though the nearest highway was a good 20 miles away, I didn't want to take any chances. I also let my brother know where I'd be, just in case. I arrived in the early afternoon, following a narrow dirt road deep into the forest. The road was rough, more like a pair of tire tracks cutting through the trees. After about 45 minutes of careful driving, I reached the clearing I had marked on my map. It was perfect. The ground was level, the creek was about 50 yards away, and there were plenty of dry logs and fallen branches for a fire. I spent the first hour setting up camp. My tent went up first, tucked between two thick pines for some wind protection. I gathered firewood, stacking it neatly near the fire pit I built with stones from the creek. I had brought a small hatchet to split some of the thicker logs, and by the time the sun started dipping lower, I had everything ready. The first night started off peaceful. I cooked dinner over the fire, just some canned stew heated in a pot. The stars came out, and the air was cold but refreshing. I felt good, confident, like I had finally done something I had been putting off for too long. But around midnight, I woke up. Something had pulled me out of sleep. I lay still in my sleeping bag, listening. The forest had a way of making every small sound feel louder at night. The rustling leaves, the occasional creak of a tree shifting in the wind. It all blended together. But then I heard something different. Footsteps, not the small, skittering sounds of a raccoon or a squirrel. These were heavier, deliberate, the kind of steps a person would make. I held my breath. The sound was close, too close, just outside my tent. I reached for my knife, keeping my grip tight. My heart pounded in my ears, and I waited, listening for any sign of movement. Then, just as suddenly as they came, the footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. Nothing. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see the surrounding trees. My campsite looked untouched. No signs of movement, no broken branches, nothing out of place. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer passing through, maybe my mind playing tricks on me after waking up in the middle of the night. I let the tension in my body ease, zipped the tent back up, and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I checked around my campsite. I looked for tracks, anything that might explain what I heard. The ground was covered in pine needles, making it hard to tell if anything had walked through during the night. But near the edge of my campsite, where the dirt was more exposed, I found something. A footprint. Not a boot print, not a hiking shoe, just the clear outline of a bare foot. I stared at it for a long time. The print was slightly smudged, but it was definitely human. Someone had been near my tent in the middle of the night. A cold unease settled over me. I scanned the trees, suddenly feeling exposed. Vulnerable. My gut told me to pack up and leave, but I had driven out here for a reason. I had planned to stay another night, and I didn't want to let some unexplained footprint scare me off. Still, I spent the rest of the day on edge. I kept my knife within reach, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. I didn't stray far from camp. I stayed busy, gathering more firewood, fishing in the creek, anything to keep my mind occupied. By the time night fell, I had convinced myself I had overreacted. Maybe it was an old footprint from a hiker who had passed through weeks ago. Maybe the wind had made a tree creak in a way that sounded like footsteps. But that night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps that woke me. It was breathing. Slow, steady breathing, just outside my tent. I froze. My whole body went stiff. My fingers wrapped around my knife. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was standing right outside. I stayed still, listening. The breathing didn't move. Stayed right there, just feet away. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard a slow, deliberate exhale, followed by soft, retreating footsteps. I waited until I couldn't hear anything else. Then, as quietly as I could, I reached for my headlamp, gripping it in one hand while I clutched my knife in the other. I unzipped the tent just a crack and flicked on the light. Nothing. But then I saw it. My firewood pile had been moved. The neatly stacked logs were scattered, some placed in odd positions. And in the dirt, next to the dying embers of my fire, was another footprint. Barefoot. I didn't waste another second. I threw everything into my backpack, barely stopping to roll up my sleeping bag. I didn't care about packing neatly, I just needed to leave. I stuffed everything into the car, my hands shaking as I started the engine. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees ahead. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I took one last look in my rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of my campsite, barefoot, motionless, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove as fast as the road would allow, my tires kicking up dirt and gravel. It wasn't until I was back on the highway, miles away from that forest, that I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I never went back to that spot. Never tried another solo camping trip. Whatever was out there, whoever was out there, I wasn't gonna wait around to find out. I made it out. That's all that matters. The first night at camp always had a certain kind of excitement to it. I was just out of high school, finally getting to experience a bit of independence with a group of friends on a camping retreat. The campground itself wasn't too deep in the wilderness, but it was far enough from town that the stars looked clearer, the air smelled fresher, and the trees stretched high and thick around us. It wasn't exactly a rugged experience. We were staying in cabins with metal bunk beds, and there was a main lodge with a kitchen and a big open space for socializing. But there was still something thrilling about being out in the woods. After we had all settled in, put our bags away, and eaten a late dinner, people started winding down for the night. Some stayed inside, playing cards or talking, while others went to sit by the fire pit, letting the warmth push back the early fall chill. I felt restless, though. Something about the dark woods beyond the camp pulled at me. I had always liked walking at night. There was something calming about it, the way the world seemed quieter, almost frozen in place. Back home, I would sometimes go for walks around my neighborhood at odd hours just to be alone with my thoughts. Out here, though, it wasn't a quiet street lined with streetlights. The paths around the camp wound through the woods, twisting into the darkness where the cabin's warm lights couldn't reach. I decided to take a walk alone. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Maybe I should have, but I wasn't planning on being gone long. Just a quick walk to stretch my legs, maybe clear my mind before bed. I stepped off the porch of the cabin, pulling my hoodie tighter around me as the night air settled in. The camp wasn't entirely silent. There was still some distant laughter from the main lodge, the occasional crackle of the fire, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But as I moved further down the trail, those sounds started to fade. The path was well worn, packed dirt with occasional roots sticking up like traps for careless feet. At first, I could still see the glow of the cabins behind me, a warm reminder that I wasn't too far from people. But as I kept walking, that glow disappeared, swallowed by the thick trees. The deeper I went, the darker it got. At some point, it became hard to see anything at all. Out here, there were no artificial lights, no glow from a distant city, no full moon to guide me, just thick trees, an empty sky, and a darkness so complete it felt like walking through ink. I slowed my pace, letting my eyes adjust. After a few minutes, my night vision started to kick in. The path wasn't perfectly clear, but I could make out enough shapes of trees, the outline of the trail ahead, the faint glint of leaves in the weak starlight. I walked for a while like that, enjoying the stillness. The air was cool but not too cold, and the forest smelled damp, like fallen leaves and earth. Every so often, I heard a small sound, branches shifting, leaves crunching, the distant hoot of an owl, but nothing alarming. Then, up ahead, I saw something. First, it was just a shape, a faint, unmoving outline against the darkness, standing right in the middle of the path. I stopped walking. My first thought was that it was a person, a small person, maybe a kid. It was hard to tell at this distance, and in the near total darkness, I couldn't make out any details. The figure stood completely still, facing my direction, but I couldn't see any features. No face, no clothing, just a silhouette against the black. Something about it immediately felt wrong. If it was another camper, why weren't they moving? Why weren't they holding a flashlight or at least shifting around a little? The way they stood there, rigid and unmoving, made my skin crawl. I didn't say anything. I didn't call out. I just stayed quiet and started stepping backward. Slowly, my heartbeat picked up, pounding in my ears. I kept my eyes on the figure, afraid that if I looked away for even a second, it would move. Didn't. I backed up further, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The ground beneath me was soft with fallen leaves, but every step still felt too loud. I was maybe 50 feet away now, and the figure still hadn't moved an inch. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to turn my back on it. Then, finally, my nerve broke. I turned and walked as fast as I could without breaking into a full sprint. My hands were shaking, my breath coming too fast, but I didn't stop. I kept going until I could see the faintest glow of the camp ahead, and only then did I let myself slow down. By the time I got back, my head was spinning. I wasn't sure if I had imagined the whole thing, if my mind had tricked me in the dark, or if there had actually been someone or something standing out there. Of course, when I told my friends, they didn't take it seriously. They thought it was funny. A couple of them were genuinely curious, but most just wanted to go check it out for themselves. I didn't want to go back, but they insisted. So, against my better judgment, I found myself leading a small group of friends back down the trail, back into the darkness, back toward that bridge. The walk felt longer this time, maybe because I was dreading what we might find. I kept my flashlight low, trying not to blind myself, but part of me didn't even want to use it. I didn't want to see anything too clearly. When we got close, I felt my stomach drop. The figure was still there. It was still standing in the exact same spot, just as motionless as before. A couple of my friends whispered behind me, debating whether it was a real person or some kind of prank. I didn't say anything. I just stared. Then someone nudged me forward. I didn't want to go. Every instinct told me to turn around and leave. But peer pressure is a powerful thing, and I didn't want to be the one who backed down. So hesitantly, I stepped closer. As I neared the bridge, my heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. And then, finally, I saw what it was. An upright vacuum cleaner, just sitting there, in the middle of the bridge. For a second, I didn't understand. My brain couldn't process it. I just stared, waiting for the image in front of me to make sense. Then, slowly, it clicked. Someone had dragged a vacuum out here and left it standing upright in the middle of the path. No reason, no explanation, just sitting there like some eerie, silent figure in the dark. Behind me, my friends started laughing. They thought it was hilarious. And honestly, after the initial shock wore off, I had to admit it was pretty funny. My mind had turned something completely mundane into something terrifying, just because I saw it in the wrong setting, at the wrong time, in the wrong lighting. But even now, years later, the memory sticks with me. Not because of what it was, but because of how my brain reacted to it. That night, standing alone in the dark woods, seeing something strange and unfamiliar, my mind didn't think that's a vacuum cleaner. It thought that's a person. And for a little while, I really truly believed it. I never found out who put it there. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe some groundskeeper had left it behind for some reason. Maybe we just happened to stumble upon something random and completely harmless. But sometimes I wonder, what if it hadn't been a vacuum? What if I had been right the first time? Southern California in late spring was supposed to be the perfect escape. Dry air, golden hills, and miles of untouched wilderness. 5 days of backpacking wasn't much compared to the months I had spent on the Appalachian Trail, but that was exactly why it was appealing. No pressure, no rush, just the two of us, moving at our own pace, enjoying good food, and sleeping under the stars. We had met while through hiking, bonding over wet boots, endless miles, and cheap ramen cooked over a tiny stove. After that, shorter trips felt easy. 5 days in the backcountry with well-packed food and lighter packs sounded like a luxury. That's why, before heading out, we stopped at Whole Foods and picked out the best food we could carry. We didn't care about weight. This wasn't a through hike where every ounce counted. Cheese, fresh vegetables, good bread, even a small bottle of olive oil. Felt like we were treating ourselves. The trail was quiet. We saw a few hikers near the start, but as the miles passed, the world emptied out. The farther we went, the more the silence settled around us. By the second day, we were deep in the backcountry, moving through sun-baked hills dotted with low shrubs and the occasional oak tree. That night, we found a good spot to camp. It was about 30 meters from a dirt service road, which was unusual. Most backcountry campsites were more remote. But it was a good site. A flat patch of dirt, soft enough for stakes but firm enough to stay dry. The only strange thing was the large metal trough near the road. tipped on its side. It was the kind used for feeding horses or cattle. We had to think about where to store our food. There were no bare cables or lockers like you'd find in more popular areas. Hanging it in a tree wasn't an option. The branches were too thin. The overturned trough seemed like the best choice. It was heavy, solid, and already resting at an angle that made it nearly impossible for animals to move. We slid our food bags underneath, feeling satisfied with the decision. The night was calm. I woke up once, briefly, to a rustling sound, but it was far off, something small moving through the brush. Not unusual. I listened for a while, then drifted back to sleep. Morning came with sharp sunlight and cool air. I stretched, feeling stiff from the ground, and stepped outside the tent. The world was quiet. No wind, no movement, just the stillness of early morning in the backcountry. My boyfriend was already up, pulling on his boots. We walked over to the trough. As soon as I crouched down and reached underneath, I knew something was wrong. One of the food bags was lighter. I pulled it out and unzipped it, my stomach tightening. Half the food was gone. I grabbed the second bag. Same thing, items missing, but not at random. Someone had picked through both bags, taking only certain things. The good stuff was missing. The cheese, the bread, the nuts, the dried fruit. For a second, I just stared at it. My mind didn't want to make sense of what I was seeing. If an animal had gotten into it, the bags would be torn. There would be teeth marks, shredded packaging, scattered food. But the bags were intact. The zippers had been opened, not ripped apart. Someone had gone through them carefully, choosing what they wanted and leaving the rest. I looked around, suddenly feeling exposed. The road was empty. The hills were still. But someone had been here. I tried to piece it together. Had they been watching us? Did they see us put the food there? Or did they just stumble across it in the night? We were miles from the nearest town. There were no houses nearby, no reason for anyone to be out here except for hikers. But why would a hiker steal food in the middle of the night? I ran through the possibilities. Maybe a desperate thru-hiker, low on supplies, saw an opportunity. But then why not take everything? Why be so selective? Why leave the instant oatmeal and the cheap granola bars but take the more expensive food? And if they had been that desperate, why not just ask? I looked at my boyfriend. His face was tight, his eyes scanning the hills like he expected to see someone standing there, watching us. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. We both knew what this meant. We didn't have enough food to finish the trip. We could stretch what was left, try to ration, but that wasn't a good idea. Out here, running out of food wasn't just an inconvenience, it was dangerous. And there was another problem, one that sat heavy in my stomach. Someone had come into our camp while we were sleeping. I thought back to the rustling I'd heard in the night. Had it been them? Had they been near our tent, listening to us breathe, waiting for the right moment? I looked at the dirt road again. It stretched in both directions, disappearing into the hills. There was no sign of footprints, no clue which way they had gone. We packed up quickly. There was no hesitation, no debate. The trip was over. As we hiked back, I kept looking over my shoulder. The quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. Felt wrong. The whole way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept waiting to see movement in the trees, a shadow on the ridgeline, some hint of the person who had been there in the night. But we never saw anything. We made it back to the trailhead by late afternoon. Our car was where we had left it, untouched. That, at least, was a relief. As we drove away, I kept playing it over in my head, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't just the food that bothered me. It was the thought of that person, whoever they were, moving through the dark while we slept. They hadn't just taken what they needed. They had picked through our food, made choices. They had been careful, deliberate. And the worst part? They had been close enough to hear us. Close enough to watch. Close enough to wait. We never figured out who it was. Maybe it was just a desperate hiker. Maybe it was someone living out there, unseen, surviving off whatever they could find. Or maybe it was something else. Someone who just wanted to remind us that no matter how far we went, no matter how alone we thought we were never really alone at all. had always liked camping alone, not because I didn't enjoy being around people, but because the solitude of the woods felt like a reset. No distractions, no noise except for the wind moving through the trees, and nothing to focus on but the basics: food, fire, and shelter. There was something about the simplicity of it that made everything else in life feel manageable. This trip was supposed to be like all the others. I had planned it for months, picking a remote spot deep in a national forest I had never visited before. I didn't want established campgrounds, picnic tables, or marked trails filled with weekend hikers. I wanted real wilderness, the kind where you could go days without seeing another person. I parked my truck at the edge of an old logging road, throwing my pack over my shoulders and locking up. The air was thick with pine, and the dirt road ahead was narrow, barely more than an overgrown path. I had mapped out a spot about 6 miles in, near a small lake that looked untouched. If everything went as planned, I'd set up camp, fish for dinner, and spend the next 3 nights completely off the grid. The first few miles were easy. The forest was dense, but the old logging road made for a clear path. The sun was still high, filtering through the tall pines, casting long streaks of gold on the ground. Birds called from somewhere unseen, and every now and then, I'd hear the rustling of something small moving through the underbrush. Squirrels, maybe a deer. But as I got deeper in, the feeling changed. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a shift in the atmosphere. The woods got quieter, the birdsong faded, and even the sound of wind moving through the trees seemed to dull. I noticed it, but I didn't let it bother me. Silence was normal in deep forests. Animals went still when they sensed something nearby, whether it was me or a predator. Around mile 5, I found something strange. An old, rusted-out truck cab, just sitting in the middle of the woods. No tires, no bed, just the cab. The glass in the windows was long gone, and the metal had been eaten through by time and weather. It didn't make sense for it to be there. The nearest road was miles away, and even if it had been left behind when logging was active in the area, why was there only the cab? I walked up to it, peering inside. Nothing but rotting leaves and dirt, but something about it felt wrong. There were deep scratches along the door, long lines carved into the rusted metal. Not from an animal, too deliberate. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the rough grooves. They were old, but not ancient. I shook off the unease and moved on. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was starting to drop behind the trees. The place was perfect, silent, undisturbed, just a stretch of calm water surrounded by thick woods. I set up my tent a few feet from the shore, gathering enough firewood to last the night. Dinner was simple: some fish I caught, cooked over the fire with salt and a squeeze of lemon from the small stash of fresh food I brought. As the sky darkened, I sat by the flames, letting the heat sink into my skin. That's when I heard it. A single snap of a branch somewhere beyond the tree line. Not close, but not far either. My head turned instantly, eyes scanning the dark. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that, everything was swallowed by blackness. I listened, waiting. Nothing. Could have been a deer, I told myself. The woods were full of them, but something about the sound felt off. Not the light, careless step of an animal wandering through the brush. It had weight, purpose. I stayed up a little longer than I planned, letting the fire burn brighter than usual. But when exhaustion won out, I forced myself into the tent, zipping it shut. The air inside was thick with the scent of nylon and earth. I lay still, listening. Silence. Then, sometime deep in the night, I woke up. Not because of a noise, not because of anything obvious, but because I felt something. The air was different, heavier, like the atmosphere itself had thickened. My skin prickled, a deep, instinctual unease creeping through me. I lay there, barely breathing. Then, from outside the tent, a footstep. Not an animal, not the light, quick sound of a raccoon or fox. A footstep, slow, deliberate. I stayed still, my body rigid. My mind went through every possibility. Another camper, maybe a lost hiker. But I knew that wasn't right. No one was out here. No one should be out here. I reached for the knife I kept in my pack, gripping the handle tight. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. Another step, closer, then another, and then nothing. The silence stretched, pressing down on me. I lay there, every muscle locked, waiting. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the thin fabric of my tent. I sat up fast, unzipping the door in one quick motion. The fire had burned down to embers, the lake was still, and everything looked exactly as I had left it. But I knew what I heard. I stepped out, scanning the area. The dirt around my tent was undisturbed. No footprints, no broken branches. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it had just been a dream. But then I saw it. The rope I had used to hang my food from a tree-thick, sturdy paracord was cut. Not chewed through, not frayed from wear. Cut. My food bag was gone. A chill ran through me. I packed up fast. Faster than I ever had before. Every noise sent a jolt through me. Every rustle of leaves made me feel like something was watching. I didn't eat, didn't stop. I hiked out in one shot, not pausing to rest, not looking back. By the time I reached my truck, my legs were shaking. I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. My hands were tight on the wheel as I started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced back once, just once, at the tree line. There was nothing there, but somehow I knew something had been, and it had been watching me the whole time. I was never afraid of camping. I grew up outdoors, spending summers fishing in clear lakes and hiking trails that wove through thick forests. I liked the quiet, the way the trees blocked out the world, how the only sounds were the wind in the branches and the distant call of birds. But after what happened last summer, I don't think I'll ever camp again. Started as a trip with two friends, Eric and Josh. We wanted to do something different. Not just a weekend by the lake, but a real trip, deep in the mountains. The plan was simple. 3 days in a remote valley, miles from any trailhead, just us and the wild. No cell service, no roads, no people. It was exactly what we wanted until it wasn't. The first day was perfect. We parked at a small dirt lot at the edge of the national forest, checked our gear, and hiked in. The trail wasn't marked, just a narrow path used by hunters and old loggers long ago. Took us most of the afternoon to reach the valley. The place was beautiful, thick pines, a slow-moving creek, and a wide clearing that sloped down into the trees. We set up camp near the water, cooked dinner over the fire, and talked about how lucky we were to have the place to ourselves. That night, I slept better than I expected. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with the usual sounds. Crickets, the rustle of small animals, the distant hoot of an owl. I woke up once, just before dawn, to something moving through the underbrush, probably a deer. Nothing to worry about. By the second day, we had settled in. We spent the morning fishing at the creek, catching a few trout, then spent the afternoon exploring deeper into the valley. The terrain was rougher than we expected. Steep slopes, thick undergrowth, fallen trees that had rotted where they lay. Around midday, we found something strange. At first, it just looked like a pile of logs. But as we got closer, I realized they weren't just logs. They were stacked, deliberately arranged, like a barricade or a shelter. It was old, covered in moss, but someone had built it. There were no trails nearby, no signs that anyone had camped here in years. We looked around but didn't find anything else. Just the structure, half collapsed, forgotten. Josh joked that it was a hunter's old blind. Eric thought it might have been built by loggers decades ago. We didn't think much of it and moved on. We made it back to camp before dark, cooked another meal, and sat around the fire. That's when things started to feel off. The forest was too quiet. No crickets, no wind, no movement. Just the crackle of the fire and our own voices. We tried to ignore it, but the silence settled over us like a weight. Then we heard it. A sound from the trees. Not an animal, not the wind. Something moving, slow and deliberate. It wasn't close. Maybe 100 yards off. just beyond the edge of our firelight. We couldn't see anything, but we knew it was there. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer or a bear passing through, but something felt wrong. It didn't move like an animal. There was no pause, no hesitation, just a steady, creeping sound. Eric grabbed his flashlight and shined it into the woods. Nothing, just trees and darkness. Eventually, the sound stopped. We stayed up a little longer, pretending everything was fine, but none of us were comfortable. When we finally went to bed, I kept my knife close, listening to every noise outside the tent. I didn't sleep much. At some point in the night, I woke up to the feeling of being watched. I don't know how to explain it, just that deep, crawling sense that someone is looking at you. I held my breath, listening. There was something outside the tent, not moving, not making a sound, just there. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting. I wanted to reach for my flashlight, but I was afraid. I didn't want to make a sound, didn't want to draw attention to myself. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the feeling was gone. The next morning, I didn't say anything. Neither did Josh or Eric. We all looked like we hadn't slept. None of us wanted to admit that something felt wrong. We decided to hike to the other side of the valley, hoping to shake off the unease. It didn't work. The deeper we went, the worse it got. Around noon, we found something else. A tree, stripped of its bark, deep claw marks running down its trunk. Not just one, several, all in a tight circle, like something had marked its territory. The scratches were deep, raw, fresh. This wasn't normal. I wanted to turn back, but Eric insisted we keep going. "It's just a bear," he said, but I knew bears didn't do this. Not like this. We kept moving. The deeper we went, the more signs we found. Broken branches, disturbed ground, the faint, lingering smell of something rotten. Then we found the bones. A deer carcass, half buried in leaves, its ribcage picked clean. But it wasn't just the bones that scared me. It was the way they were arranged, stacked almost carefully in a neat little pile. This wasn't a bear. We turned back, fast. By the time we reached camp, the sun was setting. None of us spoke. We just packed up what we could, throwing gear into our bags, ready to leave at first light. That night was the worst. I woke up to the sound of something moving again, closer this time, right outside the tent. Slow, heavy footsteps. I held my breath. Then the sound of fabric stretching. The tent. Something was touching the tent. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then silence. I don't know how long I lay there before I passed out. When I woke up, the sun was rising, and the campsite looked the same, except for one thing. There were footprints around the tent. Bear. Human. But they weren't ours. We left immediately. We didn't talk, didn't stop, didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there with us. I just know I'll never go back. I grew up down a long dirt road in rural Alabama. My family owned a decent amount of land, and for most of my childhood, that land was my playground. It was peaceful, quiet, just endless fields, thick woods, and the occasional distant sound of a neighbor's tractor. I still miss that peacefulness sometimes, but I'm a gamer, and I need my high-speed internet. Back then, though, I didn't care about any of that. My world was the woods, the creeks, and the trails I'd worn down with years of running through them. I knew every inch of that land, every tree that was good for climbing, every patch of ground that turned into thick mud after a heavy rain. And even though I felt like I knew it all, there were parts of the woods I never lingered in. Places that made me uneasy for reasons I couldn't explain. But at 12 years old, I wasn't about to admit that to anyone, especially not my best friend. It was early winter when we decided we were finally old enough to camp on our own. We had camped with family before, with adults nearby and big campfires that burned all night. But this time, we wanted to do it by ourselves. We picked a spot in a field that sat right at the edge of the woods. It wasn't far from the house, maybe 500 or 600 yards. Far enough to make us feel brave, but close enough to run home if something went wrong. The field was mostly flat, with a few patches of dried grass and weeds sticking up, and the tree line started right at the edge, dark and thick. We got everything set up before the sun went down. A small tent, a tiny fire, and a bag full of junk food we'd raided from the kitchen. Everything felt normal, good even. The air was cold, but the fire kept us warm. It was one of those nights where the world feels completely still. No bugs, no frogs, nothing. Just the occasional gust of wind that sent the last few dead leaves skittering across the ground. I don't remember what we were talking about before it happened. Probably something stupid, like which video game was the best or how long we thought we could survive if we had to live in the woods forever. Then we heard it. Came from the trees. A scream. Not a person. Not a dog. Not anything I had ever heard before. It was long, drawn out, and full of something that made my stomach drop. It wasn't just loud. It was sharp, cutting through the quiet like a blade. It had a tone to it that I can't really explain. Something wild and angry and almost painful. We both went rigid, staring at each other across the fire. We didn't say a word, but I knew we were thinking the same thing. Run to the house. But we didn't. We were tough kids, or at least we wanted to be. We weren't about to run home just because we heard a weird noise. So, without really discussing it, we made a silent agreement. We'd get in the tent, zip it up, and wait it out. The fire burned lower as we crawled inside. We left our junk food and drinks outside, too nervous to open the flap again once we were in. The inside of the tent felt small, the air thick and too warm with both of us crammed in there. I laid there, wide awake, listening. My friend fell asleep first. I don't know how. I could still hear that scream echoing in my head, over and over, like a sound that had no business being in the world. The fire outside flickered against the tent walls, casting a dim orange glow. It made me feel a little better. As long as I could see that glow, I knew the fire was still burning. I watched the light dance across the fabric, patterns shifting as the flames moved. It was almost hypnotic, and then it changed. The light disappeared. Just for a second, like something had walked between the fire and the tent. I stopped breathing. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no rustling, just that brief moment of darkness before the firelight returned, flickering like nothing had happened. I waited, every muscle in my body locked up, my hands gripping the sleeping bag so tight my fingers hurt. I listened harder than I ever had in my life, straining to hear the smallest sound. Nothing. I wanted to wake my friend up, but I couldn't move. I just stayed there, staring at the faint glow outside the tent, trying to convince myself that I imagined it, that it was just the wind or maybe a trick of the light. 30 minutes passed, maybe more, couldn't tell. I was sweating under the sleeping bag, but I didn't want to move. I felt trapped between the need to breathe and the fear that whatever was outside would hear me if I did. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get air. I slid the sleeping bag down just enough to see. The fire was nothing but glowing embers now, barely enough to cast a glow. The air outside the tent was still. No movement, no sound, just the cold creeping in through the fabric. I stared at the faint light for what felt like hours. My eyelids got heavier. My heartbeat slowed. At some point, exhaustion won. I fell asleep. Morning came fast. The sun was shining, bright and golden, cutting through the last bit of frost clinging to the grass. My friend was already outside, stretching and yawning like he'd had the best sleep of his life. I crawled out, squinting in the light. The fire was just a pile of white ash now, our food and drinks untouched. Nothing looked disturbed. We talked about the scream, about how weird it was, how creepy it had sounded. I told him about the firelight, about how I thought something had passed between it and the tent. We looked for tracks. Nothing. For years, we never figured out what made that scream. We joked about it, made up stories about monsters in the woods, but deep down, it stuck with me. That feeling, that sound. Then, years later, we finally got an answer. A panther. People started seeing them more. Stories spread, farmers catching glimpses of sleek, black shapes moving through the trees, hunters hearing sounds they couldn't explain. I don't know if it was the same one we heard that night. I don't know if it had been watching us from the tree lean, waiting, moving silently around our tent. But I do know this, when I heard that scream, something deep in me knew. We were never alone that night. I had always been the type of person who preferred quiet, isolated places over crowded campgrounds. There was something about the deep woods, the stillness of being truly alone with nature, that felt more real than anywhere else. No cell service, no distractions, just the sounds of the wind through the trees, the occasional snap of a twig, the distant rush of a river. I had been on dozens of solo camping trips before, and nothing had ever gone wrong. This time, I had planned a 4-day trip into a stretch of national forest that I had never explored before. It wasn't a designated campground, just public land with no marked trails, no ranger station, nothing. I had studied maps beforehand and picked a spot near a small, unnamed lake about 5 miles in. It looked perfect, remote, untouched, exactly the kind of place I liked. The hike in was uneventful. The terrain was mostly flat, with dense pine trees crowding the sides of the trail. I had to navigate using my GPS and compass, following a faint deer path through the undergrowth. Every so often, I would pass signs of wildlife, scattered bones from an old kill, bear scat, deep claw marks on tree trunks. Nothing unusual. Out here, everything belonged to something. By mid-afternoon, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I expected, maybe the size of a football field, surrounded by thick woods on 3 sides with a narrow, rocky shoreline. The water was still dark, the kind that didn't reflect much light. There were no signs of other campers, no fire pits, no trash, nothing. It was exactly what I had been looking for. I set up camp about 50 yards from the water, clearing a flat spot for my tent beneath a tall pine. The ground was covered in dry needles, soft and quiet underfoot. After gathering firewood and filtering some water, I cooked a quick meal and sat by the fire as the sun dipped below the tree line. The temperature dropped fast. The silence out here was heavy, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. I had just started to relax when I heard something. A splash. Not a small one like a fish breaking the surface. It was louder, deeper, as if something heavy had stepped into the water. I turned toward the lake. The fire cast just enough light for me to see the shoreline. But beyond that, the water was nothing but blackness. I listened, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. No more splashes, no movement. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, but something about it had been off. It had sounded deliberate, like a footstep, not an accidental misstep into the water. I shook it off and climbed into my tent, zipping myself in. The forest was always full of noises at night. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. If I let every little sound get to me, I'd never sleep. But I didn't sleep. Somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up. I wasn't sure why. Everything was silent, too silent. Then, from outside my tent, I heard breathing. Slow, steady. Not an animal. It wasn't close, maybe 20 feet away, but I could hear it, clear as anything. Long inhales, slow exhales. Someone standing in the dark, just watching. I held my breath, straining to hear past the pounding of my heartbeat. Then the breathing stopped. A few seconds of absolute silence. And then footsteps, not crashing through the brush like a deer or bear. Careful, deliberate steps, circling my tent. I could feel the pressure of the situation pressing down on me. My knife was under my sleeping bag, but that was all I had. My rifle was locked in my truck, 5 miles away. My only real option was to stay still. Hope whoever it was didn't try to get in. The steps moved around to the other side of my tent, then stopped. More breathing, closer this time. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, waiting for something to happen. It must have been at least an hour before I heard the first light drizzle of rain. A few drops at first, then more. The sound of rain hitting my tent was enough to mask any faint noises outside. I waited longer until the tension in my muscles was unbearable before finally daring to move. I slowly unzipped my sleeping bag, listened. Nothing. I reached for my knife, gripping it so tight my fingers ached. Then, inch by inch, I unzipped the tent door. The rain was coming down steady now, pattering against the ground, the trees, the lake. I saw nothing. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. The only movement was the rain rippling across the surface of the lake. I wanted to believe that whoever had been out there was gone. Maybe they had been waiting for me to fall back asleep. Maybe the rain had made them give up. Either way, I wasn't staying. I packed my bag in under a minute. I left my tent behind. I didn't care. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. The hike back was the longest 5 miles of my life. Every step, I expected to hear footsteps behind me. Every time the wind moved through the trees, I flinched. The rain had turned the trail to mud, making every step slow, exhausting. But I didn't stop. Not once. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I ran. I didn't look back. I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and sat there, breathing hard, my hands shaking against the steering wheel. It was another 5 miles before I had enough service to call someone. The sheriff didn't seem too surprised when I told him what happened. He just told me that people went missing out there sometimes. Said I was lucky. I haven't been camping alone since. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, where the woods stretched for miles and lakes dotted the landscape like puddles after a storm. Camping was a way of life. My friends and I had spent countless nights under the open sky, cooking over a fire, telling stories, and waking up with the damp smell of morning dew clinging to our sleeping bags. We knew the land well. That summer, the 4 of us, 2 guys, 2 girls, all around 19, decided to camp at a familiar spot by a lake. It wasn't far from where we lived, but it was isolated enough to feel like we were truly out there, away from everything. The only way in was a narrow dirt path, barely wide enough for a vehicle, and the only way out was the same. On one side of our campsite was a steep, 40-foot cliff. On the other, rocky terrain that stretched into thick woods. The lake itself was calm, dark, and deep. The spot was one of our favorites. Secluded, quiet, perfect. We arrived in the late afternoon, setting up camp the way we always did. 2 tents, side by side, not far from the water's edge. We had a cooler full of drinks and food, a small portable grill, and the usual camping gear. We didn't bring much, just enough to last the night. We planned to fish, cook what we caught, and enjoy the warmth of a fire before crashing in our tents. By the time the sun started dipping below the treeline, we decided to walk down to a fishing spot about a minute or 2 from camp. It wasn't far, just around a bend in the shoreline. We grabbed our rods, a small tackle box, and a couple of drinks before heading out. I remember thinking how calm the lake was that evening. The water barely moved, and everything was still. We fished for about an hour, laughing, drinking, and enjoying the quiet. The only sounds were the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface and the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. The entrance to our campsite was directly behind us, across the water. If anyone had come or gone, we would have seen them. But when we returned, our campsite was gone. Not just disturbed, not just rummaged through, gone. The firewood we had gathered, gone. The cooler full of food, gone. Our tents, our sleeping bags, our clothes, our backpacks, gone. Everything we had brought with us, except for what we took fishing, had vanished. We stood there, frozen, staring at the empty patch of dirt and grass where our camp had been. The ground was undisturbed. No drag marks, no signs of struggle, no footprints in the dirt except our own. It was as if we had never set up camp in the first place. I remember my chest tightening, my stomach twisting into a knot. It didn't make sense. There was no way someone could have taken everything without us seeing or hearing them. We had been fishing near the only entrance. If a person had come in, they would have had to walk right past us. There was no other way. I walked in circles, scanning the ground, my mind racing. Could a bear have dragged our stuff off? No, not without leaving a mess. A storm? No. The air was still, and even if strong winds had somehow carried things off, the tents wouldn't have disappeared completely. Someone playing a prank? No one else knew we were here. I reached for my pocket, feeling for my keys. Thank God I still had them. The only reason I had kept them on me was because my keychain had a bottle opener attached to it. If I had left them in my tent, we would have been stranded. Our vehicles were a 10-minute canoe ride away, and our flashlights were still in them. We didn't waste time. We grabbed what little we had, our fishing rods, tackle box, whatever was in our pockets, and got in the canoe, paddling back across the lake. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something standing on the shore, but there was nothing, just darkness creeping in over the trees, the lake stretching out behind us like a sheet of black glass. When we reached our vehicles, we used the headlights to scan the water, the shoreline, the tree line. Nothing, no movement, no sign of life, just the quiet hum of the forest, the occasional chirp of a cricket. We debated going back to look for our stuff, but decided against it. We weren't thinking straight, and the idea of stepping back into that empty clearing made my skin crawl. If something or someone had taken our gear, we didn't want to walk right into it in the middle of the night. The next morning, we returned in daylight. We expected to find something. Shreds of a tent, an empty beer can, a fishing knife, anything. But the campsite was just as empty as we had left it. No sign that we had ever been there. It was like our gear had never existed. I walked to the edge of the cliff behind our site, peering over. 40 feet straight down, jagged rocks at the bottom. No way anything had fallen down there without making a sound. I climbed over the rocks on the other side, searching for any trace of our belongings. Nothing. We searched for hours, covering every inch of the area. No torn fabric, no footprints, no cooler, no gear, nothing. The only explanation that made any kind of sense, if you could even call it that, was that someone had taken our stuff while we were fishing. But that was impossible. We had been blocking the only way in and out. There was no boat, no other path, no footprints. It didn't make sense. We never got any answers. We left that day and never camped at that spot again. I still think about it sometimes, trying to piece together what happened. Maybe there's a logical explanation. Maybe we missed something. But even now, years later, the thought of it makes my skin crawl. Camping has never felt the same since. I had planned the trip for weeks. A solo camping trip deep into the Utah backcountry, far from crowded trails and campgrounds. I wanted solitude, real solitude, where the only sounds were the wind, the distant echo of a hawk's cry, and the crunch of my boots on dry earth. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, but this time I wanted to push further, beyond the usual routes, into the winding canyons where few people ever went. The drive out took nearly 5 hours. The last stretch was a dirt road, rough and uneven, leading deeper into the wilderness. By the time I parked near the trailhead, the afternoon sun was already casting long shadows across the landscape. I slung my pack over my shoulders, checked my gear one last time, and started down the trail. The canyon stretched ahead, carved over thousands of years by flash floods and erosion. Sheer walls of sandstone rose on either side, streaked with layers of red and orange. The trail was faint, mostly just a game path, marked by the occasional pile of rocks left by past hikers. I walked for hours, the silence only broken by the occasional rustling of a lizard darting through the brush. The deeper I went, the narrower the canyon became. At some points, I had to turn sideways to squeeze through. It was exactly what I had been looking for: complete isolation. As the sun started to dip below the canyon walls, I found a flat, sheltered spot against a rock face to set up camp. I unrolled my sleeping bag, set up a small fire pit, and boiled water for my dehydrated meal. By the time I finished eating, the last light had faded, leaving the canyon in total darkness. I lay back, staring up at the sliver of sky visible between the towering rock walls. The stars were brilliant, untouched by city lights. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust. Then I heard it, a sharp, distant sound like a rock shifting, maybe 50 yards away. I tensed, my ears straining. The canyon amplified every noise, making it hard to tell how far away it really was. I told myself it was just the wind knocking loose some stones. But then it happened again. Closer this time. A dry scrape against rock. I sat up slowly, my breath suddenly too loud. My flashlight was within reach, but I hesitated to grab it. I didn't want to shine it around and make myself more visible. Instead, I stayed still, listening. Minutes passed. Nothing. I lay back down, forcing myself to relax. It was probably just the natural shifting of the canyon walls, cooling in the night air. Rocks moved all the time out here. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was awake again, heart pounding, unsure why. I listened. The fire had burned down to embers. The night was dead silent. Then there it was, a single footstep, close, not a falling rock, not an animal rustling through the brush. A deliberate, careful footstep on loose dirt. I didn't move. My pulse thudded in my ears. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly, but I still didn't turn it on. Another step, then another. Slow, cautious, maybe 20 feet away now. My throat went dry. There was no reason for anyone else to be here. I had hiked miles off trail. No campsites, no roads, no reason for anyone to be passing through. I stayed absolutely still, breathing through my nose, trying not to make a sound. The steps stopped. I strained my eyes, but the darkness was thick. Whoever it was, they weren't using a light. Minutes dragged by. I wanted to reach for my knife, but any movement might give me away. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps retreated. Not rushed, just slow and steady back the way they had come. I lay there, rigid, until the first hint of dawn turned the canyon walls a soft gray. When the light was strong enough, I finally sat up and scanned the area. Nothing. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there. I told myself I must have imagined it, but I didn't really believe that. I packed my gear quickly, my skin crawling with the sense that I had stayed too long. I decided to take a different route back, a longer one, but one that kept me out of the narrowest sections of the canyon. I hiked fast, my legs burning, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. By midday, I had reached a small plateau overlooking the valley below. I took a moment to catch my breath. That's when I saw it. Far below, at the edge of the dry riverbed, a figure stood. Too far to make out any details, but I knew. They had been following me. They weren't hiking. They weren't carrying gear. Just standing there, watching. I turned and walked faster, refusing to look back again. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I drove away, gravel spitting from my tires, not stopping until I hit the main highway. I never reported it. What would I say? That someone walked near my camp at night? That I saw a figure in the distance? But I know what I felt, and I haven't gone back since.